Hey there, night listeners! Tonight we're stepping into a place you've probably romanticised 1,000 times, the Victorian boarding house. You know, that cosy little refuge where plucky heroines found their independence and charming lodgers shared tea-time gossip. Yeah, forget all that. The real story involves leaking ceilings, territorial warfare over the warm chair, and a landlady whose ledger book held more power than any courthouse judge. Think Sherlock Holmes had it rough on Baker Street? That was luxury accommodation, friend. We're talking about the actual boarding houses where a third of London's working population squeezed themselves into crooked rooms, shared a single bathroom, and learned that survival meant mastering an entire underground economy of favours, silence, and strategic biscuit distribution. So go ahead and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from right now? Hit that like button if you're ready for the unglamorous truth about Victorian lodging life. Now dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's walk through that creaking front door together. Because tonight, you're about to learn how to survive in a house that's literally tilted against you. Ready? Let's go. So picture this. You're standing on a street that makes modern urban grime look like a minor inconvenience. We're talking about a London thoroughfare where the fog isn't just atmospheric, it's practically a physical barrier you have to push through like walking through wet curtains. The year is somewhere in the 1880s, and you've just arrived in the great metropolis with your life savings tucked into an inner pocket, and absolutely no idea what you're getting yourself into. The address you've been given leads you to a row of houses that lean into each other like exhausted workers at the end of a 16-hour shift, which coincidentally is exactly who lives in them. These buildings aren't falling down, mind you. They're just settling. Constantly. Forever. The Victorians built things to last, they just didn't necessarily build them to stay perpendicular to the ground. You climb the front steps, which creak in a way that somehow sounds judgmental, like the house itself is already questioning your life choices. The door opens before you can knock, which should probably be your first warning sign, but you're too busy trying to look respectable and not like someone who's been travelling third class for the past 6 hours. The woman standing in the doorway is Mrs. Hewitt, though you won't learn her first name for approximately 3 years, if ever. She's somewhere between 40 and immortal, wearing black that's been black so long it's achieved new and interesting shades of not quite black, and she's holding a ring of keys that could double as a medieval weapon. Her expression suggests she's seen it all before, is seeing it all again right now, and is not particularly impressed with the rerun. "You'll be the one from the advertisement," she says. Not asks, says, as if your entire existence has already been filed away in some mental ledger under P for predictable. Come in then. Mind the step. Second one's loose. This is how rules are delivered in a boarding house, as simple statements of fact like weather observations. It will be cold. It will rain. The second step is loose. You will obey, or you will find yourself on the street. There's no negotiation, no discussion, no customer service smile. This isn't a hotel. This isn't even technically a home. It's more like a waiting room for lives that haven't quite figured out where they're going yet. You step inside, remembering to avoid the second step, which immediately tries to eat your foot anyway. The hallway is narrow enough that you could touch both walls simultaneously if you were the sort of person who went around touching walls for no reason. The wallpaper is a pattern that might have been flowers once, before decades of coal smoke and London air turned it into something more abstract. There's a smell that's not quite unpleasant but definitely not inviting either. A combination of boiled vegetables, old wood, someone's medicinal tea, and what you'll eventually learn is just the natural perfume of 12 people sharing one bathroom. The stairs are immediately in front of you, rising up into darkness like a challenge. Mrs. Hewitt is already halfway up them, moving with the kind of efficient speed that suggests she's climbed these particular stairs approximately 40,000 times and has optimized every step. Hot water Mondays and Fridays, she calls back without turning around. Breakfast at 7, not a minute after. No visitors after 9. No singing after 10. No cooking in rooms. No washing in rooms. No pets, no children, no exceptions. You're trying to commit all this to memory while also climbing stairs that seem to have been designed by someone who had only heard stairs described to them but had never actually seen any. Each step is a slightly different height. The handrail is smooth from generations of hands but also somehow sticky. The walls are close enough that you instinctively turn sideways, even though there's technically room to walk normally. First floor's the Davidsons and Mr. Fletcher, Mrs. Hewitt continues, apparently operating under the assumption that you can listen, climb, and not die simultaneously. Second floor's Miss Perry, Mrs. Cardwell and the Lewins. 3rd floor's Mr. Morrison and Mrs. Young. You're on the 4th floor. Of course you are. Because nothing says welcome to Victorian London quite like living in what's essentially an attic that someone optimistically decided to call a room. By the time you reach the 4th floor landing, you're breathing like you've just run a marathon, which is unfortunate because Mrs. Hewitt is watching you with an expression that clearly says, "And this one won't last a month either." She produces a key from her ring with the kind of flourish a magician might use for pulling a rabbit from a hat, except significantly less whimsical and more menacing. The door opens with a sound like a sigh, which is appropriate, because that's exactly what you do when you see what's inside. Room is perhaps a generous term. Geometric experiment might be more accurate. The ceiling slopes down from left to right in a way that makes you wonder if perhaps the architect was having some kind of episode when he drew up the plans. The window is small, already fogged up from the inside despite nobody having been in here for weeks, and appears to be crying. Actually crying. Little drops of condensation are rolling down the glass like tears, which seems like a pretty heavy-handed metaphor for your current situation, but there you go. The bed is pushed into the corner, not by choice but by necessity, because it's the only corner where you could actually lie down without hitting your head on the sloped ceiling. There's a small table that's trying its best to be useful despite having 3 legs that are all different lengths. Someone has thoughtfully wedged a folded piece of cardboard under the short leg, which has worked about as well as you'd expect, meaning not at all. There's a chair that looks like it's plotting something. A washstand with a basin and pitcher, both of which have seen better decades. A small wardrobe that's leaning backward at an angle that defies several laws of physics. And the floor? Oh, the floor. It's not just sloped, it's actively hostile. You watch as Mrs. Hewitt sets down a penny to demonstrate, and the coin immediately begins a slow, determined journey toward the floorboards, where it disappears into a gap with a tiny triumphant ping. Floor takes things, Mrs. Hewitt observes, as if this is a charming quirk rather than outright theft. Mind your small items. The walls are thin enough that you can hear Mr. Morrison next door having what sounds like an argument with his kettle. The window rattles in its frame despite there being no wind. The whole room has a slight smell of old wood and yesterday's rain, and something indefinably musty that you suspect might just be the smell of London itself, concentrated and bottled for your convenience. Rent's due Sundays, Mrs. Hewitt continues, apparently satisfied that you've absorbed the full horror of your new accommodations. 5 shillings weekly in advance. That includes breakfast and use of the kitchen after dinner service. Linen's changed monthly. Coal extra, but you'll want to share costs with Mr. Morrison. He's got the stove that actually draws properly. She's already moving back toward the door, her job apparently complete. You're still standing there trying to figure out if the room is tilted or if you're having a stroke. Hot water, Mondays and Fridays, she repeats, as if this is the most important information you'll ever receive. And honestly, it probably is. Don't knock unless there's fire, and even then, think about it first. And then she's gone, her footsteps receding down the stairs with impressive speed, leaving you alone with your slanted room, your crying window, and your new life as a Victorian boarding house resident. Let's talk about what that actually means, because this isn't exactly the charming London adventure you might have imagined. This isn't Sherlock Holmes territory with Mrs. Hudson bringing up tea and biscuits while you solve mysteries. This is the reality for about 1/3 of London's working population in the late Victorian era. People who couldn't afford to rent an entire house, but also couldn't quite stomach the idea of a common lodging house, where you'd be sleeping in a room with 50 other people. The boarding house existed in this weird middle ground between respectable and desperate. If you lived in one, you were simultaneously too poor to have your own place, and too proud to admit you were basically one bad week away from the workhouse. It was a delicate social balance, like being on a tightrope made of thread and pretense. Your room, slanted and hostile as it is, represents a significant chunk of your weekly wages. If you're making around 15 shillings a week, which would be typical for a clerk or shop assistant, you're spending 1/3 of your income just to have the privilege of living in a space where gravity works sideways. But it comes with a key. Actual key which you can lock. Privacy, in Victorian London, was a luxury item more valuable than most people's entire wardrobes. The slope of the room isn't an accident or a quirk of bad construction. Well, it is bad construction, but it's also just what happens when you build houses on London clay and then proceed to add extra floors that the original foundation definitely wasn't designed to support. These houses were constantly settling, shifting, adjusting. Living in one was like living on a very slow-moving ship that was perpetually trying to tip over but never quite committing to it. You set down your bag, which immediately begins sliding toward the floorboards, because of course it does. Everything in this room is subject to the whims of the slant. You're going to need to develop strategies, little accommodations to the tilt. Wedge things against walls. Put heavy items on the uphill side. Learn to walk at a slight diagonal. It's like living in a funhouse, except not fun, and also you pay for the privilege. The condensation comes from the temperature difference between inside and out, and in a room this small and poorly ventilated with no insulation to speak of, that window is going to cry pretty much constantly from October to March. You could wipe it down every morning and it'll be back to sobbing by noon. It's like having a very passive-aggressive roommate who expresses their feelings exclusively through moisture. You approach the bed with the kind of caution usually reserved for approaching wild animals or suspicious street vendors. The mattress is a thin affair stuffed with what you desperately hope is horsehair and not something more exotic. There's a wool blanket that has the texture of something that's been washed approximately never and air-dried in coal smoke. A pillow that's more concept than comfort. And when you sit down, the bed frame lets out a shriek that echoes through the entire house like you've just mortally wounded it. Somewhere below you hear a muffled voice shout, "New arrival!" Great. You've announced your presence to the entire house by attempting to sit on your own bed. This is going to be a learning experience. The walls are doing you no favours either. They're thin enough that you can hear Mr. Morrison quite clearly now, and he's moved on from arguing with his kettle to having what sounds like a full conversation with himself about the price of coal. On the other side, someone is coughing with the kind of rhythm that suggests they've turned it into a hobby. Below you, there's a sound that might be music or might be someone strangling a cat in slow motion. Privacy, you're learning, is a relative concept. You have a door that locks, sure, but you're essentially living inside a wooden echo chamber where every sound, every movement, every sneeze and sigh becomes community property. Your neighbours will know when you wake up, when you go to bed, when you're having a good day or a bad day, and definitely when you're trying to eat biscuits quietly at midnight. You stand up to investigate the washstand, and immediately your foot finds a loose floorboard that makes a noise like a rusty hinge crossed with a dying whale. Mental note, avoid that specific spot or use it strategically to announce your movements. The floorboards are like a wooden alarm system designed by someone who hates peace and quiet. The washstand itself is a masterpiece of minimal functionality. The basin has a chip in it that's been there so long it's developed its own patina. The pitcher is one of those sturdy Victorian affairs that could probably survive the apocalypse, but couldn't hold water without dripping from a hairline fracture along the base. There's a small mirror above it that's so spotted and foggy you can barely make out your own reflection, which is probably for the best given how you look after hauling yourself up 4 flights of stairs. Cold water only, of course. Hot water Mondays and Fridays, as Mrs. Hewitt emphasised approximately 17 times. That means 5 days a week, you're washing with water that's only a few degrees above freezing. In winter, you'll be breaking ice in the pitcher some mornings. Good luck finding thermal underwear or central heating in this century. Your morning wash is going to be less refreshing daily ritual and more brief agonising punishment for the crime of wanting to be clean. The wardrobe, leaning at its impossible angle, turns out to have exactly 3 hooks inside and a shelf that's already occupied by what looks like a previous tenant's forgotten collar stud. You're going to be living out of your bag for a while, or learning to fold clothes in ways that accommodate a shelf that's doing its best impression of a slide. There's a candle stub on the table, which you'll quickly learn is your primary light source for the evening. Gas lighting in the communal areas if you're lucky, candles in your room, and a constant low-level anxiety about burning the whole place down. The Victorians had a surprisingly casual relationship with open flames in wooden buildings filled with fabric and coal dust. It's fine. Everything's fine. Nothing to worry about. You walk to the window, navigating the slanted floor with the grace of someone who's had exactly 30 seconds to adapt to living on an incline. The view is spectacular, by which I mean you can see directly into the back of another boarding house exactly like this one, where someone is hanging washing on a line strung between buildings. Their window's also crying. It's like looking into a mirror that shows you the same depressing reality from a slightly different angle. The street below is a symphony of Victorian city life. Horses, carts, people shouting, someone selling something that might be food or might be small rocks. It's hard to tell from up here. The noise level is what you'd expect from a busy street, except it never stops. Never. There's no quiet hour. London doesn't sleep. It just gets slightly less loud between 2 and 4 in the morning, and even then there's always someone clattering past with a cart or shouting about fish. You're going to need to make this work. Not because you want to, but because the alternatives are worse. You could try to find cheaper lodging, but cheaper means sharing a room with strangers, or staying in a doss house where you rent a rope to lean on for the night. Yes, that was a real thing. You paid twopence to literally lean on a rope stretched across a room, standing up all night because lying down cost extra. Suddenly your slanted floor and weeping window don't seem quite so bad. You could try to find more expensive lodging, but that would require having more money, which you don't, because if you did, you wouldn't be here in the first place. The boarding house is precisely calibrated to your economic reality, affordable enough that you can manage the rent, expensive enough that you'll never quite save enough to leave. This is going to be home. This tilted, creaking, thin-walled box in the sky is going to be where you sleep, where you dream, where you recover from 12-hour workdays and prepare for the next one. You'll learn every crack in the ceiling, every groan of the floorboards, every particular sound that Mr. Morrison's kettle makes when it's close to boiling. You'll learn to wedge the table just right so it doesn't rock. You'll figure out exactly which spot on the bed produces the least alarming screech. You'll develop a complex relationship with that weeping window, checking it every morning like you're checking on a sad friend. You'll learn to walk the slanted floor without thinking about it, your body automatically adjusting to the angle. The rules Mrs. Hewitt rattled off aren't just house rules, they're survival instructions. Hot water Mondays and Fridays means you plan your entire week around those two glorious opportunities to not freeze while washing. No knocking unless there's fire, and even then think about it, means everyone in this house is constantly tired and constantly irritated, and you'd better have a damn good reason for disturbing anyone. No visitors after 9 means if you want any kind of social life, it happens outside these walls or before bedtime. No singing after 10 is actually about no making noise after 10, but Mrs. Hewitt has had enough arguments about what constitutes noise that she's just banned the most obvious example. No cooking in rooms is a fire hazard rule that everyone breaks anyway, heating up tea or soup when they can't face going downstairs. No washing in rooms means you can't do your laundry here, which creates a whole secondary economy of who uses which sink when, and whose turn it is to monopolise the backyard line. No pets, no children, no exceptions is the boarding house's way of saying, we're barely managing adult humans, don't even think about adding complexity. Although you'll quickly discover that this rule is enforced selectively. Mrs. Cardwell on the second floor definitely has a canary. The Lewins next door to her absolutely have a child, they just pretend he's visiting when Mrs. Hewitt is around. Rules in a boarding house are more like guidelines that everyone agrees to pretend are absolute, while simultaneously figuring out how to work around them. You sit back down on the shrieking bed, more carefully this time, and it still shrieks but maybe slightly less aggressively. The room settles around you with various creaks and groans, like the house itself is adjusting to your weight distribution. You can hear the building breathe. That's not metaphorical. The walls expand and contract with temperature changes. The floors shift with footsteps above and below. The whole structure is in constant subtle motion like a living thing. This is when the reality sets in. You're not visiting London anymore. You're not a tourist having an adventure. You're a resident of this leaning tower of Pisa cosplaying as housing. This is your daily life now. The slant is your slant. The weeping window is your weeping window. That floorboard that sounds like a dying animal is your personal dying animal floorboard. You'll need to develop the specific skill set required to survive here. Learning to navigate stairs in the dark because candles are expensive and you're not wasting one just to go down for a glass of water. Figuring out the precise schedule of when the bathroom's available, because there's one bathroom for 13 people, and if you don't stake your claim at the right moment, you're waiting an hour. Understanding the social hierarchy of the kitchen, because breakfast at 7 means everyone's trying to use the same stove simultaneously, and there's a whole complex system of who goes first. You'll need to master the art of being simultaneously present and invisible, making enough noise that people know you're there and not dead, but not so much noise that you become a problem. Participating in the life of the house without overstepping boundaries that shift constantly and are never explicitly explained. Reading social cues through walls and floorboards and the general mood of the hallway. The penny you dropped earlier has gone forever, by the way. The floor has claimed it. This room is like a very slow-motion carnival game where everything gradually migrates toward the floorboards and then disappears into gaps that seem specifically designed to steal your belongings. You're going to lose buttons, coins, needles, probably a sock or two. The floor is hungry and patient, and eventually it gets everything. You stand up and start unpacking, which is hilarious because you don't really have anywhere to put anything. Your spare shirt goes on one of the hooks. Your other pair of socks goes on another hook. Your third hook gets your good jacket, the one you wear when you're trying to look like you haven't been living in an attic. Everything else stays in your bag, which you've wedged against the wall on the uphill side so it won't slide away while you sleep. There's a knock on the door which startles you because Mrs. Hewitt specifically said not to knock unless there's fire. You open it to find a thin man with spectacular sideburns and the kind of face that suggests he's seen things, probably too many things, and would like to unsee at least half of them. "Morrison," he says, not offering a hand because his are full of coal. Next door. "You'll want some of this." He's offering to share coal. This is your first introduction to the boarding house economy, a complex system of barter and favour that operates parallel to the official rent payment system. Coal is expensive, fireplaces are necessary, and it's cheaper to pool resources than freeze separately. "Half a scuttle, 2 pence, he continues. "Stove draws better on my side anyway. You try heating this room solo, you'll spend your whole wage on fuel. This is absolutely true. Your fireplace, small and inadequate as it is, would consume your entire budget trying to heat a room that leaks warmth through every gap and crack. Sharing costs with Morrison makes economic sense and also makes social sense. You're literally living in each other's pockets, might as well acknowledge it. You fish out 2 pence, careful not to drop them because they'll disappear into the floor immediately, and accept half a scuttle of coal. Morrison nods, apparently satisfied that you're not completely stupid, and disappears back into his room. This is how it works. Everyone in this house is poor, everyone's struggling, and everyone's survival depends on a web of small transactions and mutual support that never gets written down anywhere. You'll share coal with Morrison. He'll probably share his newspaper after he's done with it. Someone downstairs will trade mending services for tea. Someone else will loan you their umbrella in exchange for you picking up their parcel from the post office. It's a whole economy based on the principle that everyone has something and nobody has enough. You build a small fire in the grate, using the coal Morrison provided and some kindling that was already here. The fireplace smokes immediately because of course it does, but eventually settles into something that produces more heat than smoke. The room warms up approximately 3 degrees, which is the best you're going to get. You'll be sleeping with your coat on most nights. As the evening sets in, the house comes alive with sound. Footsteps on the stairs, someone arguing about something indistinct, the smell of cooking drifting up from below, water running in pipes that rattle like they're auditioning for a percussion ensemble. The walls tell you stories whether you want to hear them or not. Mrs. Young is home. You can hear her moving around with the distinctive pattern of someone who's done this exact routine every night for years. The Lewins' secret child is being suspiciously quiet, which probably means they've bribed him with something. Miss Perry is singing very quietly, which means it's before 10, and she's calculated she can get away with it. You're part of the house now. Another story in this vertical village of displaced people. Your sounds will join the chorus. Your footsteps will become familiar to your neighbours. Someone below will learn to identify when you're having a rough day based purely on how heavily you climb the stairs. You'll become known for something, whether it's the person who always forgets to avoid that squeaky floorboard, or the one who's usually up early, or the one who snores in a particular rhythm. This is boarding house life. It's not elegant. It's not comfortable. But it's shelter, it's semi-private, and it comes with a key that locks. In Victorian London, for 5 shillings a week, that's not nothing. You lie down on the shrieking bed, which shrieks one more time just to remind you who's boss, and stare up at the slanted ceiling. Tomorrow you'll start learning the real rules, the ones Mrs. Hewitt didn't mention because they can't be said out loud. You'll figure out the bathroom schedule and the kitchen politics and which floorboards to avoid. You'll learn how to live in a house that's constantly negotiating with gravity and losing. But tonight, in this tilted room with its weeping window and thieving floor, with the sounds of a dozen other lives bleeding through the walls, you're home. Sort of. In the same way that a life raft is sort of a boat. It'll keep you afloat, but you wouldn't exactly call it comfortable. The window keeps crying. Mr. Morrison's kettle starts up again next door. Someone downstairs drops something that sounds expensive. The floor takes another one of your buttons while you're not looking. Welcome to the boarding house. Mind the slant. Watch your small items. Hot water Mondays and Fridays. Don't knock unless there's fire, and even then, think about it first. You're going to need to learn to love this place, or at least develop a complicated relationship with it that resembles affection from certain angles. Because this crooked, creaking, thin-walled box is all you've got, and honestly, it beats sleeping on a rope. Now that you've survived your first night in the slanted room, it's time to talk about the true centre of power in this establishment. Not the front door. Not the kitchen. Not even the single bathroom that 13 people are somehow expected to share without murdering each other. No, the real heart of this boarding house, the throne from which Mrs. Hewitt rules her crooked empire, is a leather-bound book that sits on the hall table like a sleeping dragon. The ledger. If you think this is just an accounting book, a simple record of who paid what and when, then congratulations on being adorably naive. This ledger is simultaneously a census, a social registry, a character assassination archive, and a prophecy of your future in this house. It's where Mrs. Hewitt records not just your rent payments, but your entire existence, distilled down to numbers, notes, and the occasional damning marginal comment that will outlive you both. You first encounter the ledger properly on your second morning, when you venture downstairs for the breakfast that's included in your rent. The hallway table is impossible to miss because Mrs. Hewitt is standing guard over it like a particularly judgmental gargoyle, and the ledger is open in front of her, pages covered in her precise, slightly threatening handwriting. "Name," she says, not looking up. "She already knows your name. You literally gave it to her yesterday." This is a ritual, not an information-gathering exercise. You state your name, and she runs her finger down the page until she finds your entry, which already contains more information than you're comfortable with. Your name, your room number, your rent amount, your move-in date, and what appears to be a note that says nervous disposition, in handwriting so neat it might as well be a medical diagnosis. She makes a small mark next to your name with a pencil that she keeps tucked behind her ear specifically for this purpose. You've been acknowledged. You may proceed to breakfast. This is how your day begins, with a literal roll call that determines whether you're still a legitimate resident or about to become a problem. The ledger doesn't leave that table. Ever. It's always there, always open to the current week's page, always available for Mrs. Hewitt to consult whenever she needs to make a decision about anything. Who gets the larger portion of porridge? Check the ledger. Who's allowed to use the parlour fire this evening? Consult the ledger. Who's going to be treated like a valued resident versus who's going to get the cold shoulder and even colder tea? The ledger knows all and tells Mrs. Hewitt everything. What's recorded in this book goes far beyond simple financial transactions, though those are certainly important. Mrs. Hewitt tracks patterns. She notes when you come home late. She records when you have visitors, how long they stay, what mood you were in when they left. She keeps track of your laundry schedule, your bathing habits, whether you're the type to return borrowed items promptly or the type who needs reminding. The ledger is less a financial record and more a comprehensive surveillance report that would make modern data collection companies weep with envy. And here's the thing, everyone knows about the ledger. Everyone knows they're being observed, assessed, ranked. And yet somehow this doesn't feel oppressive. It feels almost comforting, in that deeply weird Victorian way where being constantly judged was just part of the social fabric. The ledger isn't hidden away in Mrs. Hewitt's private office. It's right there on the hall table, visible to anyone who passes by, a constant reminder that your actions have consequences and those consequences are being recorded in permanent ink. The pages are divided into columns with headers that tell you exactly what Mrs. Hewitt considers important. Name, obviously. Room for identification purposes. Rent due and rent paid, which you'd expect in any normal accounting. But then you get into the interesting columns. Conduct, punctuality, visitors, and my personal favourite, notes, which is where Mrs. Hewitt exercises her particular brand of brutal honesty. You learn to read the ledger upside down because getting caught looking at it directly would be unspeakably rude, but everyone does it anyway. You develop the skill of glancing at the page while walking past, absorbing information in half-second intervals, piecing together the house hierarchy from cryptic abbreviations and shorthand. Mr. Morrison next door has been here for 3 years, which you can tell because his entry takes up multiple pages in the back sections. His conduct column has a single word, satisfactory, which in Mrs. Hewitt's vocabulary is practically a love letter. His notes section contains observations like shares coal appropriately and maintains reasonable hours, which explains why he's achieved that most coveted of boarding house statuses. He's become invisible to management, not because he's unnoticed, but because he's so consistently acceptable that he requires no active supervision. Miss Perry on the second floor has more interesting notation. Her conduct says generally acceptable, which is 2 steps down from Morrison's satisfactory, and includes the word generally, which implies occasional unacceptability. Her notes section mentions singing after hours crossed out and replaced with improved behaviour noted, which tells you that Miss Perry got a warning, adjusted her habits, and is now in Mrs. Hewitt's good graces again. This is the boarding house legal system in action. Transgression, notation, correction, redemption, all recorded for posterity. The Lewins, your neighbours on the second floor with a secret child, have the most diplomatically worded entry you've ever seen. Their notes section says family visiting frequently, which is such an obvious euphemism it's almost charming. Mrs. Hewitt knows they have a child living with them. They know she knows. She knows they know she knows. But as long as the child is quiet and doesn't cause problems, and as long as the Lewins maintain the polite fiction that little Timothy is just visiting every single day of his life, everyone can pretend the rules aren't being bent like a politician's principles. Mrs. Cardwell, with her definitely existing canary, has a note that says maintains appropriate quiet, which is code for the bird doesn't sing loud enough for me to officially acknowledge its existence. This is the boarding house equivalent of don't ask, don't tell. As long as you're not forcing Mrs. Hewitt to enforce rules she'd rather ignore, she'll pretend not to notice your minor violations. Then there are the entries that tell darker stories. Empty rooms with the last occupant's name crossed out, sometimes with notes like departed without notice, or the more ominous removed for disturbance. These are the cautionary tales, the reminders that boarding house residency is a privilege that can be revoked. You don't want your name to be crossed out. You don't want to become a warning to future tenants. The financial columns tell their own stories. You can see who pays on time and who's always a few days late, who paid in full and who negotiated a reduction for some reason that's recorded in abbreviated code, who added extra for coal or laundry services. The ledger is a complete economic map of the house, showing who's thriving and who's barely hanging on. But the real power of the ledger isn't in what's written, it's in what could be written. Mrs. Hewitt's pencil, eternally tucked behind her ear, is a constant threat. Mess up badly enough and you get a note. Accumulate enough notes and your conduct rating drops. Let your conduct rating drop too far, and suddenly you're being asked to find alternative accommodation. The pencil is mightier than the eviction notice because it provides the documented justification for the eviction notice. This is Victorian management style at its finest. Everything documented, everything recorded, everything held in reserve as potential evidence. There's no arguing with the ledger. You can't claim you didn't know the rules or didn't understand expectations when Mrs. Hewitt can flip back 3 weeks and point to the exact date when you received a warning. The ledger is judge, jury, and historical record all in one leather-bound package. The sound of the ledger matters too, which sounds ridiculous until you've lived in the house for a week and developed a Pavlovian response to certain noises. The soft rustle of pages turning means Mrs. Hewitt is reviewing something, possibly your something, and you should probably be on your best behaviour. The sharp tap of the pencil on paper means someone's getting a notation, and you desperately hope it's not about you. The decisive thump of the ledger closing means judgment has been rendered and the matter is settled. But the most important sound is the clink of coins hitting the hall table. This is the sound of rent being paid, which is not just a financial transaction, but a weekly ritual that determines your standing in the house hierarchy. The sound of those coins tells everyone within earshot that you're current on your obligations, that you're a legitimate resident, that you have the right to occupy your slanted room for another week. Mrs. Hewitt has remarkable hearing when it comes to the specific acoustics of money. You could drop a penny in the front parlour and she'd somehow appear from the kitchen to witness it. But the weekly rent payment is practically a performance. You don't quietly hand over your coins. You don't whisper about finances. You place your rent on the hall table with enough firmness that the coins make their distinctive clink, announcing to the entire house that you're financially stable and not a problem. The quality of the clink matters too. Coins paid with confidence sound different from coins paid with reluctance. Mrs. Hewitt can apparently hear the difference between here's my rent, everything's fine, and here's my rent, this is my last bit of money, and I'm terrified. She responds accordingly. Pay with confidence, and you get a brisk nod and a neat check mark in the rent paid column. Pay with obvious anxiety, and she somehow knows to give you a slightly larger breakfast portion the next morning. A small kindness that will never be acknowledged or mentioned, but that's been duly noted in the ledger under some code only she understands. This is where the ledger becomes more than just a record book. It becomes a tool of governance. Mrs. Hewitt uses it to manage an entire household of people who are all struggling, all proud, and all desperate to maintain the appearance of respectability. The ledger allows her to track who needs help, who's taking advantage, and who's maintaining the delicate balance of boarding house citizenship. There's a whole ranking system embedded in the ledger's pages, invisible until you learn to decode it. Top-tier residents like Mr. Morrison get their names written in the firmest hand, their entries are neat, and their columns are balanced. They're the backbone of the house, the reliable rent-payers who never cause drama and always follow the unspoken rules. They get privileges: first access to hot water on Mondays and Fridays, the better seat in the parlour, an extra scoop of sugar with their morning tea, the benefit of the doubt when something goes wrong. Mid-tier residents, which includes most people, get standard treatment. Their names are written clearly, their entries are maintained, but there's no particular favour or disfavour. They pay their rent on time, mostly follow the rules, occasionally need a reminder about something. They're fine. They're acceptable. They're the median of boarding house society, and as long as they don't slide backward, they'll maintain their place. Bottom-tier residents get their names written in lighter pencil, like Mrs. Hewitt isn't confident they'll be around long enough to justify permanent ink. Their entries have more frequent notations, more warnings, more crossed-out promises to do better. These are the people on probation, the ones who are one bad week away from having their names crossed out entirely. They get the cold tea, the smaller portions, the constant surveillance. They're temporary until they prove otherwise. The genius of this system is that it's completely transparent and completely deniable. Mrs. Hewitt never explicitly tells you your ranking. She never announces that Morrison gets better treatment or that the person in room 7 is on thin ice. But everyone knows. You can tell by the size of your breakfast portion, by the warmth of your tea, by the tone Mrs. Hewitt uses when she says good morning. The ledger doesn't just record behaviour, it determines treatment, and treatment reinforces behaviour, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of respectability or failure. And here's the really fascinating part: this system works. Not in a cruel way, but in a weird, functional way that keeps a house full of strangers from descending into chaos. Everyone knows where they stand. Everyone knows what's expected. Everyone knows that improvement is possible and decline is preventable. The ledger provides structure in a world that's otherwise pretty unstructured for working-class Victorians living hand-to-mouth. You watch the ledger rituals play out every day. Mrs. Hewitt opening it first thing in the morning, reviewing the day's expectations. Residents pausing as they pass the hall table, glancing down to check their own entries or snoop on their neighbours. The evening ritual of Mrs. Hewitt making her final daily notations before closing the book and tucking her pencil away, the house's official day complete. There are small ceremonies around the ledger that take on almost religious significance. When a new resident arrives, their name is entered with particular formality. Mrs. Hewitt's hand especially careful as she writes in the blank space, creating a new identity in the house's official record. When someone leaves, their final entry is summed up and closed out, a brief epitaph of their time in residence. 6 months, satisfactory conduct, departed for better circumstances, or the less cheerful, 3 weeks, multiple disturbances, asked to leave. The ledger outlives everyone. Mrs. Hewitt has ledgers going back a decade, stored somewhere in her private quarters, a complete history of every person who's ever rented a room in this house. Your entry will eventually be relegated to those archived volumes, your brief time in the slanted 4th-floor room reduced to a few lines of notation that future landlords might consult if you need a reference. Because that's the other terrifying power of the ledger. It writes your reputation. Need to rent another room somewhere else? The new landlady will ask Mrs. Hewitt for a character reference. Mrs. Hewitt will consult her ledger, read out your conduct rating and selected highlights from your notes, and that will determine whether you get the new room or not. The ledger is your permanent record, your report card for being an acceptable human in shared housing. This creates interesting incentives. You find yourself moderating your behaviour not just to avoid immediate consequences, but to maintain a good ledger entry. You're extra quiet after 10 not just because you don't want to disturb the neighbours, but because you don't want noisy after hours appearing in your notes. You return borrowed items promptly not just because it's polite, but because returns items promptly is the kind of positive notation that improves your standing. The ledger turns everyone into their own best supervisor. Mrs. Hewitt doesn't need to constantly monitor everyone because everyone's monitoring themselves, aware that they're being recorded and that the record matters. It's crowdsourced surveillance, Victorian style, where the panopticon is a leather-bound book on a hall table. But the ledger isn't just about control, it's also about memory. Mrs. Hewitt remembers things about her residents that they've forgotten themselves. She can tell you exactly when you moved in, what you were wearing, what time of day you arrived. She knows your patterns better than you do because she's been noting them systematically while you've been living them unconsciously. "You always come home late on Thursdays," she'll mention casually, and you'll realise she's right, and you'll wonder what else she's noticed that you haven't. This creates a strange intimacy. Mrs. Hewitt knows things about you that your own family doesn't know. She knows your financial situation, your social habits, your personality quirks, your strengths and weaknesses as a tenant. She's probably the person who knows you best in the entire world, even though you've never had a personal conversation that lasted more than 3 minutes. The ledger mediates your relationship, turning lived experience into data points that somehow capture more truth than any heart-to-heart chat could manage. The marginalia in the ledger are particularly revealing. These are the notes that Mrs. Hewitt writes to herself, observations that don't fit in the official columns but that she wants to remember. Receives letters from Mother Monthly, which tells her you have family support. Shoes in poor repair, which tells her you're struggling financially even if your rent is current. Always says please, which tells her you have manners and were raised properly. These tiny notes accumulate into a complete personality profile. Some notations are protective. Sister ill, financially strained means Mrs. Hewitt knows you're going through something and she'll quietly cut you some slack without making a big deal of it. Lost position seeking work means she knows you're unemployed and she might accept rent a few days late while you sort yourself out. The ledger allows Mrs. Hewitt to be kind without appearing soft, to make exceptions without setting precedents. Other notations are warning signs. Multiple visitors of dubious character means someone's bringing trouble to the house. Smell of alcohol noted means someone's drinking habits are becoming a problem. Aggressive in morning means someone's not a morning person, but has crossed the line from grumpy to genuinely unpleasant. These notes build a case, establishing a pattern that justifies future action if behaviour doesn't improve. The absolute worst notation you can receive is disgust. This means you've done something serious enough that Mrs. Hewitt had to have an actual conversation with you about it, and that conversation was notable enough to record. Discussed noise levels, or discussed visitor policy, or the truly ominous discussed general conduct. Once you've been discussed, you're on notice. Your next infraction might be your last. The best notation, the one that every resident dreams of achieving, is no issues noted. This appears in the entries of people who've achieved perfect boarding house zen. They're so consistently acceptable that there's literally nothing remarkable to say about them. They've become the behavioural equivalent of beige wallpaper. Present, functional, completely unproblematic. This is the highest compliment Mrs. Hewitt's ledger can give. If the ledger is the heart of the boarding house power structure, then Sunday evening is when that heart beats loudest. Rent day, the weekly reckoning, the moment when everyone's financial stability becomes public knowledge through the medium of coins hitting a table. The entire house starts getting tense around midday Sunday. It's like watching a storm roll in, except the storm is made of anxiety, and the chance of precipitation is 100%. Breakfast is quieter than usual. People avoid eye contact. There's a lot of unnecessary tidying and organising nervous energy that has to go somewhere. This is the day when you're reminded, uncomfortably clearly, that your home isn't really yours. It's rented temporarily week by week, and your continued residence depends entirely on your ability to produce 5 shillings every 7 days without fail. Miss 1 week, and suddenly you're having very uncomfortable conversations with Mrs. Hewitt. Miss 2 weeks, and you're helping yourself out the door before you get pushed. The timing of rent day is specifically calculated to maximise psychological impact. Sunday evening, after the weekend but before the work week begins. Late enough that you've had all day to organise your finances, early enough that you can't claim you forgot. It's the hinge between leisure and labour, and Mrs. Hewitt has positioned herself right in that pivot point where she has everyone's full attention. Around 4 in the afternoon, people start drifting down to the hallway, even though rent isn't officially due until 6. They're checking the ledger, reviewing their entries, making sure everything's in order. It's like studying for a test you've already taken. Futile, but somehow necessary. You can't change what's written, but you can at least be fully informed about your own situation before Mrs. Hewitt summarises it out loud. Morrison next door has a system. He comes down exactly at 5:45, coins already counted and arranged in his palm, and places them on the table with the confidence of someone who's never missed a payment in 3 years. The coins clink with authority. Mrs. Hewitt makes a check mark without looking up. Morrison nods and disappears back upstairs. The entire transaction takes 12 seconds and establishes the gold standard for how rent payment should proceed. Everyone else is considerably less smooth about it. Miss Perry comes down early, clearly nervous despite having never missed a payment. She hovers near the hall table like a bird that's not sure if landing is safe. When her turn comes, she counts out her coins twice before placing them down, apologising for nothing in particular, and speed walking back to her room before Mrs. Hewitt can comment. Her coins clink with anxiety, and everyone listening can hear the difference. The Lewins come down together, which is strategic. It's harder for Mrs. Hewitt to comment on their secret child situation when they're presenting a united front. They pay with exact change, not a penny over, which tells you they've calculated their finances down to the last coin. Mr. Lewin does the actual placement while Mrs. Lewin maintains eye contact with Mrs. Hewitt, a small act of defiance that says, yes, we're paying, yes, we'll continue paying, no, you don't get to make us feel bad about our living situation. It's very dignified for people who are hiding a 6-year-old in a room that's not supposed to contain children. Mrs. Cardwell with the canary pays in silver coins that are probably older than anyone in the house. You suspect she's been saving these specific coins for years, keeping them separate from her regular money, using them exclusively for rent. They clink with history. Mrs. Hewitt examines them carefully, not for value but out of what seems like respect for coins that have clearly been through some things. There's a silent acknowledgement between the two women, a recognition of long-term residency and consistent reliability. Then there are the difficult payments. Young Mr. Fletcher from the first floor, who's clearly spent most of his wages on something other than rent, and is now scrambling to make up the difference. He counts out his 5 shillings in a mixture of coins that includes several pennies and what might be a button he's hoping Mrs. Hewitt won't examine too closely. She does examine it. It is a button. He has to go find another penny. Everyone pretends not to notice, but everyone absolutely notices. His entry in the ledger probably gets a note about this. Mrs. Young comes down last because she always comes down last. A power move that says she's not anxious about rent day because she's been here longer than the wallpaper. Her payment is casual, almost dismissive, like she's doing Mrs. Hewitt a favour by continuing to rent here. Which, given that she's been a model tenant for 5 years, maybe she is. Her coins don't so much clink as announce themselves. Mrs. Hewitt's checkmark for Mrs. Young is particularly firm, acknowledgement of a transaction between equals rather than landlady and tenant. You're somewhere in the middle of this hierarchy, neither completely confident nor obviously struggling. You've counted your rent money 3 times, separated it from your other coins, and placed it in a pocket where you can't accidentally spend it. When your turn comes, you approach the hall table with what you hope looks like casual confidence, but probably looks like moderate terror. The coins leave your hand and hit the table with a sound that's probably fine, but that you're going to be analysing for the next 3 hours. Was that confident enough? Did it sound like you can easily afford this? Or did it sound like that was your last 5 shillings and you're now going to be eating plain bread for a week? Mrs. Hewitt doesn't look up, which you're choosing to interpret as a good sign. Her pencil makes a mark in the ledger. You're current for another week. You can breathe. But here's the thing about rent day. It's not actually about the money. Well, it is about the money. Obviously, Mrs. Hewitt needs the money. But the ritual of rent day serves a much bigger purpose. It's a weekly reset, a reminder of everyone's place in the house hierarchy, a public accounting of financial stability, and most importantly, a demonstration of who can be relied upon and who's starting to crack under pressure. The house is different after rent day. There's a collective sigh of relief around 6:30 when the last payment has been made and Mrs. Hewitt closes the ledger with her usual definitive thump. The tension breaks. People start talking again. Someone puts a kettle on in the kitchen. The parlour fire gets lit. Suddenly everyone's friendlier, more relaxed, ready to interact like humans instead of anxious debtors waiting for judgment. This is when the real economy of the boarding house kicks in. With rent settled for the week, people can start thinking about other needs, other transactions, other ways to make life bearable until next Sunday rolls around. The formal economy of shillings and pence gives way to the informal economy of favours and barter, and this is where things get interesting. Mrs. Cardwell appears in the kitchen with her sewing basket, which is the signal that she's available for mending services. She won't charge money, because money's for rent and food, but she'll accept payment in other forms. A cup of tea with real sugar. First access to tomorrow's newspaper. Someone running an errand for her so she doesn't have to go out in the rain. Her needlework is exceptional, so there's always demand, and she's built up a complex web of favours owed and favours due that probably rivals the formal economy in complexity. Morrison emerges from his room with his coal supply, already portioned into half scuttles, ready to sell to anyone who's willing to go in on shared heating costs. This isn't charity, it's pure economics. He bought in bulk, which was cheaper per unit, and now he's reselling at a slight markup that's still cheaper than buying retail. Everyone wins, except possibly Morrison's fireplace, which is doing most of the actual work. Miss Perry, who's been hoarding lemon somehow, announces that she's making lemon water and there's enough to share if anyone has sugar to contribute. This starts a whole negotiation involving 3 different people, 2 types of sugar, and a promise of future biscuits. The lemon water eventually materializes and gets distributed according to some calculation that only the participants fully understand. The Lewins offer to take anyone's outgoing post to the post office tomorrow, since they're going anyway, in exchange for someone watching their room for an hour next Tuesday when they both need to be out. This is code for someone who won't report our child's existence to Mrs. Hewitt, and everyone understands this without it being stated. Mrs. Young agrees to the watch, because she's been here long enough that she's above petty rule enforcement, and the deal is struck with handshakes. This is the currency of trust, and it only flows after rent is paid. Before rent day, everyone's too stressed about their own financial situation to think about helping others. After rent day, with another week of shelter secured, people can afford to be generous. Not financially generous, nobody has spare money, but generous with time, skills, attention, and small kindnesses that make boarding house life survivable. You participate in this economy by offering to collect water from the pump tomorrow morning for anyone who needs it, since you're going down anyway and 1 extra bucket isn't that much more work. 3 people take you up on this, which means you now have 3 small debts out in the house economy. Mrs. Cardwell will remember you when you need a button replaced. Morrison will give you a better rate on coal. Miss Perry will save you some lemon water next time. These aren't formal agreements, they're just understood reciprocity, the social glue that holds this entire structure together. The queue for the wash basin becomes a negotiation space rather than a battle zone. I'll go after you if you let me borrow your soap. And, you take my spot today, I'll save you a spot tomorrow. And, I need 5 minutes longer, but I'll heat water for you if you wait. Everything's tradable. Everything has value. Everything can be negotiated as long as you're willing to participate in good faith. Someone produces biscuits from somewhere, probably hidden since last week specifically for post-rent day sharing. The biscuits get divided according to complex social calculations that would require a doctorate in anthropology to fully understand. People who helped someone move furniture last month get slightly larger pieces. People who are known to be struggling financially get offered seconds. People who are generally pleasant to be around get better crumbs than people who complain constantly. The biscuits are delicious and also a complete social ranking system disguised as dessert. The parlour becomes neutral territory after rent day. During the week, there's a whole complex system of who gets to sit where and when, based on seniority, rent payment history, and general standing in the house. But Sunday evening after rent, the parlour is communal space where normal hierarchies are temporarily suspended. The warm chair by the fire, usually claimed by Mrs. Young through sheer force of having been here longest, becomes available to whoever gets there first. This is radical egalitarianism by Victorian boarding house standards. People actually talk to each other on Sunday evenings, not just the necessary excuse me and after you of hallway navigation, but actual conversations. Mr. Fletcher talks about his work at the counting house. Mrs. Cardwell mentions she's expecting her sister to visit next month. Morrison incredibly makes a joke. It lands poorly, but everyone appreciates the effort. Miss Perry sings a little after 10 technically, but nobody's going to report her to Mrs. Hewitt on rent night. The Lewins' child is absolutely behind that closed door, but everyone's pretending extra hard that he isn't. You find yourself sitting in the parlour with people you've been living next to for weeks but barely know. The shared relief of having made rent creates a temporary bonding experience. You're all in this together, all struggling with the same problems, all trying to maintain respectability on wages that barely cover basics. For a few hours on Sunday evening, the boarding house feels almost like a community, instead of just a collection of strangers who share walls. Mrs. Hewitt makes tea. Real tea, not the dust and stems that sometimes pass for tea during the week, but actual decent tea that's been saved for occasions. She doesn't announce this or make a big production of it, just sets out cups and a pot and mentions that there's tea available if anyone wants some. This is as warm as Mrs. Hewitt gets, her version of celebrating another successful week of rent collection and household management. The tea gets consumed with appropriate reverence. You wrap your hands around the warm cup and feel your shoulders drop from around your ears for the first time since Thursday. The sugar bowl makes the rounds. Someone found actual milk from somewhere. This is luxury on a level that would be difficult to explain to anyone who hasn't lived in a boarding house, and survived on cold water and stale bread most of the week. Conversations drift into comfortable territory. Complaints about work that everyone understands because everyone's work is some variation of long hours and poor pay. Discussion of neighbourhood gossip that's been accumulating all week. Speculation about whether Mrs. Hewitt is going to raise rent next quarter, which she probably isn't because rent's been stable for 2 years and she's not actually trying to drive anyone out. Planning for the week ahead. Who needs what from which shop, who's going where and could pick something up for someone else. This is when you learn the real rules of the house, the ones that Mrs. Hewitt never stated explicitly but that everyone follows. Don't accuse anyone of anything directly, just mention that something's gone missing and see who volunteers information. If you touch the communal kettle, you're obligated to fill it for the next person. Kindness must be anonymous because acknowledged kindness becomes a debt and debts between poor people get complicated. If someone's struggling, you help without making it obvious you're helping, because pride is often the only thing people have left. Someone mentions that old Mr. Davies 3 streets over has died, which leads to a surprisingly philosophical discussion about mortality and whether he had it coming, which apparently he did because he was unpleasant to his wife. This turns into speculation about what his wife will do now, whether she'll stay in the house or move somewhere smaller. Someone suggests she might take in boarders, and there's a collective shudder at the thought of competition for Mrs. Hewitt. Nobody wants to live anywhere else, even though nobody would admit this building is particularly great. It's just known. The slant is your slant. The problems are your problems. The evening winds down naturally. People drift back to their rooms one by one, the parlour emptying in reverse order of seniority. Mrs. Young leaves first because she can, having earned the privilege of going to bed whenever she damn well pleases. The Lewins leave second because their secret child probably needs attention. Others follow according to some social calculation you don't quite understand yet, but that clearly matters. You head back up to your slanted room, navigating the stairs in semi-darkness because the hallway lamp has been turned down to save oil. Your room is cold because you used up most of your coal earlier in the week and can't justify buying more until you've recovered from rent day expenses. But the bed, shrieking and uncomfortable as it is, feels earned tonight. You made rent. You're secure for another week. You participated in the house economy and came out with your dignity intact and several small debts that will make next week slightly easier. The window is still crying because of course it is. Mr. Morrison's kettle is making its evening sounds through the wall. Someone downstairs is coughing in that rhythm that's become familiar background noise. The floor probably took something of yours while you were gone because that's what it does. But you're home. Sort of. For another week at least. And next Sunday you'll do it all again. The slow build of anxiety throughout the day. The careful counting of coins. The moment of placing rent on the hall table with the right amount of confidence. The relief afterward. The small economy of favours and barter that makes life bearable. The temporary community in the parlour over decent tea. The retreat to your slanted room where everything's wrong, but at least it's consistently wrong. This is the rhythm of boarding house life, measured out in weekly intervals, punctuated by rent day, sustained by complex networks of mutual support that nobody talks about but everyone depends on. You're part of that network now. Your coins made their sound. Your name got its check mark. You have your place in the ledger and your spot in the house economy. You've survived another week, and honestly, that's about all anyone can ask for in Victorian London. The ledger sits on the hall table, closed now until morning, holding everyone's records and secrets and small stories. Mrs. Hewitt is somewhere in her private quarters, probably reviewing next week's accounts, planning next month's supplies, making her own calculations about who's thriving and who's struggling. The house settles with its usual creaks and groans, everyone tucked into their various slanted rooms, another rent day successfully navigated, another week of shelter secured. Your last thought before sleep is about next Sunday's rent, which is ridiculous because you just paid today's rent, but that's how it works when you're living week to week. There's always a next payment looming, always another Sunday coming, always another moment when you'll need to prove you deserve to stay. But for tonight you're paid up and current and legitimate. For tonight you can rest. Tomorrow the real week begins again, but that's tomorrow's problem. If you thought living in a boarding house meant blending into anonymous urban existence, then congratulations on being spectacularly wrong. The morning routine in a Victorian boarding house is less quiet start to the day and more involuntary theatre performance where everyone's both actor and audience. You're about to become intimately familiar with your fellow residents' habits, whether you want to or not, and trust me, you definitely don't want to. Your education in boarding house anthropology begins around 6 in the morning, which is when the first resident begins their day with all the subtlety of a brass band having a breakdown. This is Mr. Wickham from the second floor, and his morning routine starts with what you initially mistake for a medical emergency, but eventually recognise as just his standard wake-up cough. It's not a gentle clearing of the throat. It's a full-body production that echoes through the walls like he's trying to dislodge a lung that's personally wronged him. This cough has a 3-part structure that you'll come to know as well as any symphony. First comes the preparatory throat clearing, a warning shot that tells everyone Mr. Wickham is conscious. Then the main event, a cough so profound it seems to originate from his shoes and work its way up through his entire respiratory system. Finally, the aftermath, a series of smaller coughs that suggest he's evaluating the success of the main performance. The entire sequence takes about 45 seconds and serves as the boarding house's least pleasant alarm clock. You lie in your slanted bed, trying to determine if going back to sleep is worth the effort, or if you should just accept that your day has begun courtesy of Mr. Wickham's lungs. The house is waking up around you with all the grace of a collection of tired, underpaid workers who would rather be literally anywhere else, which is exactly what they are. By 6:15, the first footsteps hit the stairs. These are distinctive, specific, identifiable even through 4 floors of Victorian construction. Heavy, deliberate, slightly off rhythm. That's Mr. Patterson from the first floor who works at the docks and needs to be out the door by 6:30 or face unemployment. His footsteps are always rushed, always purposeful, and always accompanied by the sound of someone who's definitely skipping breakfast, because time is more valuable than food. Patterson's morning routine is pure efficiency. You can track his progress through the house by sound alone. Front door opens. Brief pause while he checks the weather with what sounds like a sigh of resignation regardless of actual conditions. Door closes with enough force to rattle windows on all 4 floors. Footsteps receding down the street at a pace that suggests he's already late. The entire sequence from waking to departure takes him maybe 12 minutes, which would be impressive if it wasn't slightly depressing. 6:30 brings Mrs. Albright, whose routine is Patterson's exact opposite. She's elderly, moving carefully down the stairs with a hand on the rail at all times, each step a deliberate negotiation with joints that stopped cooperating sometime around 1870. Her progress is so slow you could probably go down, make breakfast, eat it, and come back up before she reaches the ground floor. But she's been here for 8 years, paying rent without fail, and nobody's going to rush her just because her knees have opinions about stairs. Mrs. Albright's morning soundtrack includes a lot of muttering to herself, which carries through the walls with surprising clarity. Left foot. Right foot. Careful now. That one's loose. She's narrating her own stair descent like a sports commentator covering the world's most cautious athletic event. When she finally reaches the bottom, there's always a small sound of triumph, like she's just summited Everest rather than navigated 3 flights of stairs. By 7, which is when breakfast officially begins, the house is in full morning chaos. This is when you learn that 13 people sharing 1 bathroom and 1 kitchen is not a functional arrangement. It's a thought experiment in human patience that someone decided to make real. The bathroom situation is governed by an unwritten schedule that everyone knows and everyone occasionally violates, leading to tense hallway standoffs. Mr. Morrison, because he's been here longest and has achieved legendary status, gets first access at 6:45. He's in and out in exactly 8 minutes, leaving the space clean and the window cracked for ventilation, which is more than can be said for some residents who shall remain unnamed, but who definitely know who they are. Miss Perry goes second at 6:53, and her routine includes what sounds like a small musical performance. She hums. Different tunes each day, always something cheerful, always slightly off-key. The acoustics of the bathroom turn her humming into a concert that the entire house gets to enjoy, which is either charming or annoying depending on whether you've had coffee yet. Today it sounds like she's working her way through something that might be a hymn or might be a music hall number. Honestly, it's hard to tell. The Lewins go third, which is actually both Mr. and Mrs. Lewin plus their definitely not living here child, all trying to use the bathroom simultaneously, while maintaining the fiction that it's just 2 people. This leads to some impressive logistics and muffled conversations through the door about whose turn it is to wash, and whether Timothy needs to brush his teeth again. The whole operation takes 15 minutes and involves more coordination than most military campaigns. Then comes the problematic slot. 7:15. This is when Mr. Fletcher is supposed to take his turn, but Fletcher has a habit of oversleeping, which means the schedule backs up like a Thames sewer during high tide. When Fletcher misses his slot, chaos ensues. People start clustering in the hallway, trying to look casual while absolutely monitoring who goes in and how long they take. The bathroom door becomes the most watched piece of wood in London. Misses. Cardwell doesn't even bother with the bathroom most mornings, having apparently decided that a basin in her room and strategic timing for other necessities is preferable to participating in the hallway Olympics. This is the kind of wisdom you develop after enough years of boarding house living. Sometimes the best solution is to opt out entirely. You, being relatively new and still figuring out the system, have been assigned the 7:45 slot, which sounds reasonable until you realise that if anyone before you runs long, you're going to be late for work. This creates a special kind of anxiety, standing in the hallway with your towel and soap, watching the clock tick toward the moment when you absolutely must leave the house, regardless of whether you've washed, praying that whoever's currently in there understands the concept of time. When your turn finally comes, you enter a space that's humid, slightly foggy, and definitely occupied by more ghosts of previous users than you're comfortable with. The mirror is completely fogged over, which is probably for the best given how you look before proper washing. The floor is wet in places it shouldn't be wet, suggesting someone's relationship with the sink involves more splashing than strictly necessary. There's a smell that's part soap, part too many people, part old pipes that haven't been properly cleaned since the house was built. You wash with the efficiency of someone who knows 8 people are waiting, and at least 3 of them are mentally calculating how to make your death look like an accident. Cold water, because hot water is only Mondays and Fridays and today is Wednesday, so you're getting the kind of wake-up experience that makes you question every life choice that led to this moment. The soap is communal, which means it's been in more hands than you want to think about, and has the texture of something that's given up on life. The mirror starts to clear as you wash, revealing your face in sections like extremely unflattering progressive reveal. You look exactly like someone who lives in a slanted attic room and washes with ice water on Wednesday mornings. Which is to say, not great. Victorian workers didn't have the benefit of moisturizers or under-eye cream or any of the products that might make this bearable. You get soap, water, and the hope that everyone else looks equally rough so nobody notices. 8 minutes. That's your allocation. Long enough to wash and attend to necessities, not long enough to do anything luxurious like enjoy the process. You finish with 30 seconds to spare, wipe down the sink because that's the rule, crack the window because the next person will appreciate it, and exit to find Mrs. Young waiting with the expression of someone whose patience has limits and you're approaching them. The kitchen situation is somehow even more complex than the bathroom schedule. Breakfast is included in rent, which sounds generous until you realise this means 13 people trying to use a kitchen designed for maybe 4, all before 7:30 in the morning, with varying degrees of cooking skill and spatial awareness. Mrs. Hewitt presides over this chaos from her position by the stove, cooking porridge in a pot large enough to bathe a medium-sized dog. The porridge is exactly as exciting as it sounds, which is to say not at all, but it's hot and filling and included in rent, so nobody's complaining. Out loud. There's definitely internal complaining happening. The porridge gets served in order of arrival, which creates an incentive to get to the kitchen early, but also creates a traffic jam of people hovering near the doorway, trying to be next without being pushy about it. British queuing instincts are deeply embedded even in spaces where there's no actual line, just a cluster of people pretending they're not all trying to achieve the same goal simultaneously. Mr. Morrison gets his porridge first, as is his right as senior tenant. He takes his bowl to the small table by the window, adds exactly 2 spoons of sugar from his personal supply, and eats in silence while reading yesterday's newspaper. This is the boarding house equivalent of a power breakfast. He's got his routine down to such a science that he could probably do it blindfolded. Miss Perry gets her porridge and immediately starts doctoring it with things she's pulled from various pockets. A small apple already cut into pieces, some raisins in a twist of paper, a pinch of cinnamon from a tiny tin. She's essentially cooking a second breakfast on top of the first breakfast, creating something that actually looks edible, while the rest of you are staring at plain porridge and contemplating your lives. The Lewins get porridge for 2, definitely not 3, and absolutely don't smuggle a third portion upstairs wrapped in a napkin for a child who definitely doesn't live here. Mrs. Hewitt watches this happen with the same expression she'd use for watching clouds pass overhead. Technically, a rule is being broken, but enforcing it would require acknowledging it, which would create more problems than it solves. So the porridge gets accidentally overportioned and everyone pretends not to notice the napkin. Mr. Fletcher, when he finally appears, gets whatever's left, which this morning appears to be the porridge from the bottom of the pot that's achieved a texture somewhere between concrete and wallpaper paste. This is what happens when you oversleep and miss your bathroom slot. The house has ways of enforcing its schedule that are more effective than any written rule. Fletcher eats his concrete porridge with the expression of someone who knows this is his own fault, but is still going to be resentful about it. Mrs. Cardwell doesn't come down for breakfast, instead making tea in her room with her illegal spirit lamp, which everyone knows about and nobody reports because Mrs. Cardwell is 73 and has earned the right to heat water however she damn well pleases. The smell of her tea drifts through the walls, something herbal and slightly medicinal that's probably better than anything the rest of you are eating. Then there's Mr. Griggs, and Griggs is special. Griggs is the house character, the resident eccentric, the person whose habits are so distinctive that new tenants get warned about him during their first week. Griggs drinks onion tea. Not tea with onions in it. Not onion soup. Onion tea. He boils onions in water, strains it, and drinks the resulting liquid like it's a perfectly normal beverage that reasonable people consume. The smell of Griggs's morning onion tea preparation clears the kitchen faster than any fire alarm. It's not just that it smells like onions, though it definitely does. It's that it smells like onions that have been betrayed, onions that have given up on life, onions that are questioning the entire concept of being onions. The smell doesn't stay in the kitchen either. It migrates. It explores. It finds its way into corners and crevices you didn't know existed. It becomes part of the house's permanent aromatic profile. Griggs himself is completely unbothered by the mass exodus his tea preparation causes. He's a clerk at some accounting firm, thin as a rail, with wire-rimmed spectacles and the demeanour of someone who stopped caring about social norms sometime around 1875. He drinks his onion tea while reading technical journals about mathematics, completely oblivious to the fact that everyone within a 20-foot radius is trying not to breathe. Good for the Constitution, he announces to nobody in particular, which is what he always says, as if the primary objection to onion tea is medical rather than olfactory. Nobody argues with him because arguing with Griggs about his onion tea is like arguing with the weather. Pointless and slightly absurd. He's going to drink his onion tea regardless of anyone's opinions on the matter. You grab your porridge and retreat to the parlour to eat it, which is the strategy of anyone who values being able to taste their food without the overwhelming presence of boiled onions. The parlour is crowded with other refugees from Griggs's morning routine, all eating porridge with the grim determination of people who are about to face 12-hour workdays and need calories more than they need flavour. This is when you start to understand that every person in this house is basically performing a character every single morning, and these performances have become so routine that they're practically rituals. Morrison with his newspaper and precise sugar portions. Perry with her pockets full of breakfast supplements. Griggs with his cursed onion tea. These aren't just habits, they're identities, ways of carving out individuality in a space where privacy is theoretical and personal space is measured in inches. Mrs. Young appears in the parlour doorway, surveying the assembled tenants like a general reviewing troops. She doesn't actually say anything, just nods slightly as if confirming that yes, everyone's still here, nobody died overnight, the house continues to function. She's been here so long that she's achieved a status somewhere between resident and institution. She doesn't participate in the morning chaos, she observes it, offering her presence as a kind of stabilising force. Young's morning routine is elegant in its simplicity. She rises early before the bathroom queue forms and completes her ablutions in private peace. She takes her breakfast in her room, prepared with her own supplies on her own schedule. She emerges only when the chaos has subsided, perfectly put together, ready to face the day with the calm of someone who has mastered the art of boarding house, living so completely that the rules no longer apply to her. You're sitting there with your mediocre porridge, watching this parade of characters, and you realise something important. You're being evaluated. Not just by Mrs. Hewitt with her ledger, but by everyone. The other residents are taking notes, forming opinions, deciding whether you're going to fit into this weird ecosystem or become a problem that needs to be managed. They're judging your sounds, the particular creak your floorboards make when you walk, the rhythm of your footsteps on the stairs, whether you close doors quietly or let them slam, whether your morning cough is acceptable or concerning. These sounds become your signature, the way the house identifies you before you even become visible. They're judging your smells, not in a creepy way, just in the inevitable way that happens when 13 people share space and ventilation is more theoretical than actual. What kind of soap you use, if any, whether you smell like your occupation, Whether you're a person who understands the importance of laundering clothes regularly or someone who needs gentle reminders, your smell is your business card in a house where walls are suggestions. They're judging your bathroom manners, which sounds ridiculous but is actually critically important. Do you leave the space clean? Do you respect the 8-minute rule? Do you crack the window? Are you one of those people who somehow gets water on the ceiling, and if so, how? Your bathroom habits reveal your character more reliably than any conversation. They're judging your kitchen behavior. Do you understand queuing protocol? Do you take a reasonable portion or try to load up like you're preparing for a siege? Do you clean your dishes or leave them for someone else? Do you acknowledge other people's space or move through the kitchen like you're the only person who exists? These small interactions accumulate into a reputation. Most importantly, they're judging your relationship with the house's resources. Water, coal, space, time. Are you someone who shares or someone who hoards? Someone who contributes to the collective good or someone who's purely transactional? In a boarding house, resources are tight and community survival depends on everyone being somewhat reasonable about distribution. Someone who takes more than their share gets noticed, and not in a good way. You're being particularly careful this morning because you're still new enough that your character isn't set yet. You're in that probationary period where every action is being weighed and evaluated and filed away for future reference. Make a good impression now, and you'll be integrated into the house social structure. Make a bad impression, and you'll be forever marked as that person who did that thing that one time. Mr. Fletcher is a cautionary tale in this regard. He's been here 6 months and still hasn't recovered his reputation from the great bathroom flooding of September, when he somehow managed to overflow the sink badly enough that water dripped through the ceiling into Mrs. Cardwell's room below. Nobody knows exactly how he accomplished this. The physics seem impossible, but it happened, and now Fletcher is forever the guy who flooded the bathroom. He's still paying for that mistake in subtle social ways, getting served last at breakfast, getting the worst seat in the parlour, getting the general vibe that the house hasn't quite forgiven him yet. You finish your porridge, rinse your bowl in the kitchen sink with exaggerated care to demonstrate your responsible dishwashing abilities, and head back upstairs to prepare for work. The stairs are busy with people going both directions, all of you trying to navigate the narrow space without actually touching each other, which is a whole different skill that takes time to develop. There's an art to passing someone on the boarding house stairs. You have to telegraph your intentions early, commit to either going up against the wall or down against the rail, maintain your path with confidence, and execute the pass with minimal body contact. Any hesitation creates a jam. Any unexpected movement causes collision. The stairs are like a very slow vertical dance where everyone knows the steps except the new people who keep messing up the rhythm. You successfully navigate past Mrs. Albright, who's on her way down for breakfast at approximately 300 feet per hour. You nod politely. She makes a sound that might be acknowledgement or might be the noise her lungs make when breathing. It's fine either way. You've shown respect to a senior resident, which is good for your reputation. Back in your slanted room, you change into your work clothes, which involves a complex calculation of what's clean enough, what's appropriate enough, and what you can actually afford to wear out because if you damage it, you can't replace it. Victorian working-class fashion is less about style and more about strategic deployment of limited resources. You've got basically 2 outfits, one for work, one for everything else. The work outfit gets worn until it's genuinely filthy, then washed, then worn again. The other outfit is for Sundays and emergencies. Getting dressed in a slanted room adds its own challenges. You can't just set things down because they'll slide away. You can't stand in certain spots because the floor's too tilted. You've learned to work with the room's geometry, using the high corners for temporary storage, keeping one foot braced against the bed leg for stability, developing the spatial awareness of someone who's constantly compensating for living at an angle. By 7:45, you're ready to face the day. You look exactly like every other working-class Victorian heading to another shift at whatever job keeps you in rent money and mediocre porridge, which is to say you look tired, slightly shabby, and deeply resigned to your economic circumstances. But you're clean, you're dressed, and you've successfully participated in the morning routine without causing any incidents. That's a victory. You head downstairs one more time, navigating the flow of people who are still in various stages of their morning routines. Mr. Wickham is finally emerging from his room, having apparently needed an extra 45 minutes to recover from his wake-up cough. Miss Perry is heading to the bathroom for the second time, carrying what looks like her entire personal grooming collection in a basket. The Lewins are arguing in whispers about something that definitely involves their child, who definitely doesn't live here. Mrs. Hewitt is at her post by the hall table, ledger open, observing the morning chaos with the calm of someone who's seen this exact performance approximately 3,000 times. She makes eye contact with you as you pass, nods slightly, and makes a small notation in her book. You're still being assessed. Every interaction is data. The ledger grows. You step out the front door into London morning, which is grey and slightly damp and smells like coal smoke and horse dung and the general aroma of too many people living too close together. The street is already busy with workers heading to their various jobs, all looking approximately as enthusiastic as you feel, which is to say, not very. But here's what you've learned from the morning parade. You're not anonymous. You're not just another face in the crowd. You're the person in room 4 who takes exactly 8 minutes in the bathroom, who rinses their breakfast bowl promptly, who passes on the stairs without causing traffic jams, who's trying very hard to figure out the unspoken rules before breaking them. You're becoming a character in the boarding house theatre, developing your own routine that other people will learn to recognise and navigate around. Next week, some new person will move in, and they'll go through exactly what you're going through now. They'll lie in bed listening to Mr. Wickham's morning cough and wonder if it's medically concerning. They'll wait in the bathroom queue, calculating their chances of making it to work on time. They'll flee the kitchen when Griggs starts preparing his onion tea. They'll watch the established residents perform their morning routines and try to figure out where they fit in this ecosystem. And you'll be one of the established residents by then, with your own recognisable habits and sounds and smells. You'll be part of the morning parade, another character in the daily performance, another data point in Mrs. Hewitt's ledger. You'll have achieved what everyone in a boarding house strives for, predictable existence. Not comfortable, not luxurious, but predictable. The house will know you by your footsteps. Your neighbours will recognise your cough. Your bathroom slot will be yours. You'll have become part of the pattern. For now, though, you're still the new person, still figuring things out, still trying not to become Fletcher 2.0. You navigate the morning streets toward your job, which is probably tedious and definitely underpaid, but which provides the 5 shillings per week that keeps you in your slanted room with your weeping window and your spot in the morning parade. The boarding house morning routine is chaos, but it's organised chaos, predictable chaos, chaos with rules. And once you learn those rules, once you find your rhythm in the morning parade, once you become just another character in the daily performance, it almost feels normal. Not good. Normal. Which in Victorian London for 5 shillings a week is genuinely the best you're going to get. Mr. Wickham coughs. Mr. Patterson rushes out early. Mrs. Albright descends the stairs like time has lost all meaning. Morrison reads his newspaper with exact sugar portions. Perry doctors her porridge with pocket supplies. Griggs drinks his cursed onion tea. The bathroom queue forms and dissolves and reforms. Mrs. Hewitt watches and records and judges. The house wakes up, puts on its collective clothes, eats its communal breakfast and sends its residents out into London to earn another week's rent. Tomorrow morning the exact same thing will happen. Same coughs, same footsteps, same porridge, same onion tea, same parade of characters performing their roles. The day after tomorrow it'll happen again. And again. And again. The routine is the point. The predictability is the comfort. In a city where everything changes constantly and economic security is a fantasy, the boarding house morning routine is reliable. It's the same chaos every day, and somehow that makes it bearable. You're part of that routine now. Your footsteps are joining the chorus. Your morning sounds are being catalogued by your neighbours. Your bathroom habits are being evaluated and ranked. Your relationship with porridge and communal resources is being observed and recorded. You're not just living in the boarding house anymore. You're performing in it, contributing to the daily show, becoming one of the birds in the morning parade, developing your own strange habits that some future new resident will observe and try to understand. And honestly, that's kind of nice. Weird, invasive, lacking in any meaningful privacy but nice. You're part of something. A community of people who are all struggling in the same ways, all trying to maintain dignity while living in questionable housing and washing with ice water and eating porridge that tastes like despair. You're not alone in your slanted room. You're part of a vertical village, a collection of characters, a morning parade that happens every single day whether you're ready for it or not. So tomorrow when Mr. Wickham's cough wakes you at 6 in the morning, you won't be annoyed. Well, you will be annoyed. Obviously, it's a terrible way to wake up. But you'll also be oddly comforted. Because that cough means the house is still functioning, the routine is still happening, your place in the morning parade is still secure. The chaos continues and you're part of it now. Welcome to the morning parade. Mind your bathroom slot. Watch your porridge portions. Try not to be Fletcher. And for the love of everything, don't let Griggs convince you to try the onion tea. Living in a room that's actively tilting requires a specific skill set that nobody teaches you in advance, and that you can't really understand until you're lying in bed at night listening to your spare button make a slow, determined journey across the floor toward its doom. The slant isn't just an architectural quirk or a minor inconvenience. It's a lifestyle. It's a personality trait. It's a daily negotiation with gravity that you're consistently losing. Your first week in the room, you tried to ignore the slant. This was optimistic and stupid in equal measure. You arranged your furniture as if the floor was level, placed objects as if they'd stay where you put them, and generally operated under the delusion that you could somehow willpower your way into living normally. This lasted approximately 36 hours before reality, and several of your possessions came sliding downhill to correct your misconceptions. The floor has an opinion about where things belong, and that opinion is down and to the left, where they can disappear into the floorboards forever. It's not a steep slope, maybe 5 or 6 degrees, which doesn't sound like much until you realize that 5 degrees is enough to make literally everything in your room develop a death wish. Coins roll away. Buttons migrate. That sock you were sure you left by the bed? It's now inexplicably near the window, having made the journey while you weren't looking, like it was trying to escape. You've had to develop countermeasures, little technologies of poor equilibrium that would probably seem insane to anyone living in a properly level room, but that make perfect sense when you're fighting geometry on a daily basis. The bed was your first engineering project, and it nearly defeated you. When you first moved in, the bed legs on the downhill side were doing absolutely no weight-bearing work whatsoever. The entire bed frame was essentially resting on 2 legs, which is half the recommended number of legs for furniture stability. Your solution involved a complex system of wooden shims that you begged off Morrison, who apparently went through the same process 3 years ago and still has spare materials. Now your bed has custom-fitted wedges under the downhill legs, carefully calibrated to bring the sleeping surface back to something approaching horizontal. It's not perfect. If you roll over too enthusiastically, the whole structure shudders and makes threatening noises. But it's survivable, which is the best you're going to achieve in this room. The table was a similar challenge, except worse because tables are supposed to be functional rather than just supporting unconscious bodies. You can sleep on a slightly tilted surface if you're desperate enough. You cannot write a letter on a table that's sending your inkwell on a slow-motion suicide mission toward the edge. The table came with 3 legs of different lengths, which suggests its previous owner also struggled with the slant but gave up and decided to just live with chaos. You've solved this by wedging folded paper under the short leg, except the paper compresses over time so you're constantly recalibrating. It's like a science experiment where the variable is how frustrated can one person get with basic furniture. Currently you're using approximately 7 pages of an old newspaper, folded into a thickness that's almost but not quite right. The table still rocks slightly when you lean on it, but at least objects stay relatively stationary, which is a significant improvement over the initial everything slides off immediately situation. The window is its own special nightmare. Not only does it cry constantly, which we've established, but the slant means condensation doesn't just fog the glass, it pools in the lower corner and then drips. Just drips. Continuously. Creating a small puddle on the windowsill that will eventually overflow onto the floor unless you manage it. Your solution is a tin cup positioned exactly at the drip point, which you have to empty twice a day or risk creating an indoor water feature that nobody asked for. The cup itself tries to slide away, obviously, because this room has opinions about where things should be. You've wedged it in place with a spoon jammed into the window frame, creating what looks like some kind of deranged art installation, but actually serves a vital drainage function. Morrison walked in once, saw your spoon and cup window drainage system, and nodded with the respect of one engineer acknowledging another's work. "Mine's similar," he said, "but I use a fork." The wardrobe, leaning backward at its impossible angle, has become a storage puzzle that would challenge a professional organizer. Anything hung on the left side gradually migrates right. Anything on a shelf slowly creeps forward until it achieves escape velocity and falls out when you open the door. You've learned to open the wardrobe carefully, hand ready to catch whatever's decided to make a break for it today. Usually it's a sock. Occasionally it's something more dramatic, like your good shirt making a desperate bid for freedom. Your shoe storage solution is to wedge them between the wardrobe and the wall where gravity pins them in place. This works until you actually need to wear the shoes, at which point you have to engage in a brief wrestling match with physics to extract them. But at least they're not sliding around the room at night, which was the previous situation, and which led to several incidents of you stepping on your own footwear in the dark and nearly dying. The coal scuttle, half full of the fuel you're sharing with Morrison, sits in the corner on the high side of the room where it can't tip. You learned this the hard way after the first placement resulted in coal dust slowly migrating downhill, creating a black streak across your floor that no amount of scrubbing would fully remove. Now there's a permanent shadow on your floorboards, a memorial to your early learning curve about slanted room physics. You've developed specific walking patterns to deal with the floor. There's a path that follows the high side where the boards are more stable. The low side has more squeaks and one board that sounds like it's questioning its entire existence every time weight hits it. You've memorized which boards make which sounds, developing a mental map of your floor's personality. Step here for the minor creak. Avoid there for the major groan. That spot in the middle has no sound but feels unstable, like it's considering a career change to hole-in floor. The chamber pot, and yes, we're talking about the chamber pot because Victorian boarding houses didn't come with ensuite bathrooms, has to be positioned very carefully on the high side of the room where it won't tip. This is not the kind of problem you want to solve through trial and error. You got the positioning right on the first try through sheer force of not wanting to deal with the alternative. Some learning experiences should be avoided entirely. Everything in your room has gradually migrated to equilibrium positions that work with the slant rather than against it. Your spare clothes live in the high corner where they can't slide away. Your candles sit on the uphill side of the table where melting wax runs away from important things. Your washing bowl rests in a specifically chosen spot where it's stable but still accessible. You've essentially feng shuied your room according to the principles of gravity and desperation. The really fascinating part is that you've stopped noticing the slant when you're in the room. Your body has adjusted. Your inner ear has recalibrated. You stand at a slight diagonal without thinking about it, compensating automatically for the floor angle. It's only when you go somewhere level like the ground floor hallway that you notice something feels wrong. The level floor seems tilted. Your body leans unnecessarily. You've adapted so completely to the slant that normal has become strange. This creates interesting problems when you have visitors, which is rare but occasionally necessary. Morrison came over once to coordinate coal delivery, stepped into your room, and immediately grabbed the doorframe for balance. "Forgot how bad yours is," he said. His room has the same slant, but apparently your room is special, possibly cursed, definitely more aggressively tilted than anywhere else in the house. You've achieved the worst room, congratulations. But the slant isn't just about physical objects and spatial negotiation. It's also about sound. The house's architecture, tilted and settled as it is, has created acoustic properties that turn the entire building into an enormous speaking tube, where everyone's business becomes everyone else's entertainment. The pipes run at angles that shouldn't work but somehow conduct sound more efficiently than any designed system. You can hear Morrison's kettle next door with perfect clarity. Not just the boiling, but the filling, the placing on the stove, the first small bubbles of pre-boil activity. You know his kettle sounds better than you know your own possessions. When Morrison makes tea, which he does at exactly 9:30 every evening, you hear every stage of the process. Water pouring, kettle settling, fire being adjusted, the slow build to boiling, the click when he removes it from heat, the pour into his cup. You're essentially attending a nightly audio performance of tea preparation. Through the floor, you can hear the Lewins' not living here child having bedtime negotiations with his parents. The words aren't clear, but the tone is universal. That's a child who doesn't want to sleep arguing with adults who desperately need him to sleep. You hear the rhythm of the argument. Child makes case, parent responds, child counteroffers, parent holds firm, child tries different approach, parent maintains position, child eventually concedes. It's like listening to a tiny diplomatic negotiation where the stakes are bedtime and the child is consistently losing. Mrs. Cardwell below you apparently snores, which you discovered your second night, and which you will continue to discover every night for as long as you both live here. It's not loud enough to be truly disruptive, but it's rhythmic enough to be noticeable. She snores in patterns that sound almost musical, like she's playing a wind instrument in her sleep. Some nights it's vaguely soothing. Other nights it's maddening. Most nights it's just there, part of the house's baseline audio environment. Through the walls you can track Miss Perry's entire evening routine. She comes home at 6:15, you hear her door open and close. She changes clothes, you hear the rustling. She hums while she does this, different tunes each night. Then she settles in to do some kind of needlework. You can hear the specific sound of thread being pulled through fabric, which shouldn't be audible through walls but apparently is. Around 8 she makes tea, probably on an illegal spirit lamp like Mrs. Cardwell. At 9 she reads, you can hear pages turning. At 10 she goes to bed, and sometimes she sings very quietly to herself, something that sounds like a lullaby, and honestly it's kind of nice. Mr. Wickham below Perry apparently talks to himself, long rambling conversations with an invisible companion who never responds. You can't make out most of the words, but you can hear the cadence, the questioning tone, the answering tone in a different pitch, the whole performance of a one-man dialogue. Is he lonely? Practicing speeches? Slowly losing his mind? Unclear. But it happens every evening like clockwork, so either he's consistently lonely, or consistently practicing, or consistently losing his mind at a steady, predictable rate. The pipes are the worst acoustic conductors, creating a house-wide communication system that nobody asked for. When someone uses water anywhere in the building, the pipes announce it to everyone. You can track people's locations by listening to the plumbing. Someone's in the kitchen, the pipes gurgle in that specific way. Someone's using the bathroom, the pipes make a different sound entirely. Someone's doing laundry in the basement, the pipes basically sing about it. You've learned to interpret these sounds, turning pipe noise into useful information. When you hear the specific combination of gurgle and flow that means someone's drawing a bath, you know the hot water is being depleted, and you should probably wait before trying to wash anything. When you hear the sharp clank that means someone just turned on the kitchen tap too forcefully, you know Griggs is making his cursed onion tea and you should probably stay in your room for the next hour. The morning pipe symphony is particularly elaborate. At 6:30, Morrison draws water for his washing. The pipes give a specific waking up groan. At 6:45, someone on the second floor uses the toilet. The pipes make a rushing sound that echoes through the entire house like an announcement. By 7, when multiple people are trying to use water simultaneously, the pipes sound like they're having an existential crisis, clanking and groaning and making sounds that suggest they're considering early retirement. You've also learned to interpret your neighbour's habits through the walls, developing a kind of unintentional surveillance capability that would be creepy if it wasn't completely unavoidable. Morrison goes to bed at exactly 10:30. You know this because his floorboards have a particular creak pattern when he's preparing for sleep. Miss Perry stays up reading until 11 most nights. You know this because the page-turning sounds stop at approximately that time. The Lewins have arguments on Tuesday nights specifically. Unclear why Tuesday is argument night, but it's consistent enough that you've started thinking of it as a weekly event. Mrs. Cardwell below you apparently does calisthenics, or possibly prays very physically, because around 7 in the morning there are rhythmic thumping sounds from her room that follow a pattern. Thump, pause, thump, pause, thump. This goes on for about 5 minutes and then stops. You've never asked what she's doing because some things are better left mysterious, but you've incorporated her morning thumping routine into your own schedule as a kind of secondary alarm clock. The house keeps no secrets because the house is physically incapable of keeping secrets. Every footstep, every cough, every dropped object, every muttered curse becomes shared information. You know when Morrison has a cold because his breathing changes. You know when Miss Perry is stressed because her humming stops. You know when the Lewins are having a good day because their child laughs in a way that carries through the floors. You know more about these people's daily lives than you know about your own family back home. This creates a strange intimacy. You're not friends with these people. Most of them you barely talk to, but you're connected to them through sound, through the shared experience of living in a building that broadcasts everyone's existence to everyone else. You worry about Mrs. Cardwell when her snoring sounds rougher than usual. You feel relieved when Morrison's kettle makes its normal 9:30 appearance, confirming he's home safe. You find yourself listening for Miss Perry's evening humming, missing it when she's out late. The house is teaching you things about living that nobody explicitly states. How to navigate a tilted room. How to work with gravity instead of against it. How to interpret sounds through walls and pipes. How to be part of a community that's connected by architecture rather than choice. How to maintain privacy when the walls are broadcasting your entire life to your neighbours. You're developing techniques, small habits that make the slant manageable. Always putting things away on the high side. Never leaving objects on flat surfaces overnight because they'll be somewhere else by morning. Checking the window cup before bed so you don't wake up to overflow. Walking with a slight lean that compensates for the floor angle. These aren't things you learned consciously. They're things your body figured out through repeated experience with gravity-based disappointment. The room has also taught you about Victorian construction standards, which is to say the standards were more suggestions than requirements. Your walls are made of lath and plaster, which sounds substantial until you realise the lath is thin strips of wood, and the plaster is basically fancy mud. The whole structure is maybe 2 inches thick total, which explains why you can hear Miss Perry turning pages. The floor is wooden boards that have shrunk and warped over decades, creating gaps that eat your belongings. The ceiling is similar boards, except they're above Mr. Wickham's floor, so his furniture legs are basically just barely not poking through into your living space. Modern building codes would have a collective breakdown if confronted with Victorian boarding house construction. There's no insulation beyond air trapped between boards, no sound dampening beyond accidental gaps, no moisture barriers beyond hoping the roof holds, no structural support beyond the original frame, and whatever's been added through generations of repairs using whatever materials were cheaply available. It's amazing these buildings are still standing. It's more amazing that people live in them. It's most amazing that the rent is 5 shillings a week for the privilege. But here's the thing about the slant, about the crying window, about the thieving floor, about the walls that broadcast your neighbour's entire life. You're adapting. Humans are incredibly good at adapting to circumstances that should probably be deal breakers, but that become normal through sheer force of exposure and lack of alternatives. The slant that seemed impossible during your first week now feels like home. Not comfortable home, not chosen home, but home in the sense of familiar, predictable yours. You know every creak in your floor, every weak spot in your ceiling, every gap in your walls, every acoustic property of your pipes. You've mapped the room's geography, understood its physics, developed workarounds for its hostility. You've achieved what everyone in a boarding house eventually achieves: functional coexistence with uninhabitable architecture. And weirdly, you're proud of this. You've mastered the slant. You've engineered solutions to problems that shouldn't exist. You've created a drainage system using cutlery. You've shimmed furniture into submission. You've learned to sleep on an angle and walk at a lean-in-place objects where gravity won't immediately betray them. These are skills nobody asked for, but that you've developed anyway. Practical knowledge for living in spaces that are barely fit for purpose. Morrison, during that one visit when he acknowledged your spoon-based window solution, told you it took him 6 months to stop fighting his room and start working with it. The house wins eventually, he said. Better to surrender early and start negotiating terms. This is wisdom you've now internalized. You're not trying to make the room level anymore. You're trying to live successfully in an unlevel room, which is a completely different challenge with completely different solutions. The slant is your destiny, in the sense that you're stuck with it for as long as you live here, which will be as long as you can afford the rent and maintain your entry in Mrs. Hewitt's ledger. The room will continue tilting, probably getting slightly worse every year as the house settles further into London clay. Your solutions will need constant adjustment. Your shims will compress. Your wedges will shift. Your cup will need repositioning as the window frame warps. This isn't a problem you solve once. It's a problem you manage continuously, making small corrections, developing new techniques, adapting to gradual changes. But that's boarding house life. Nothing's permanent except the rent coming due every Sunday. Everything's temporary except the temporary arrangement of living here that keeps extending indefinitely, because the alternatives are worse. The slant is just the physical manifestation of the whole situation. You're living at an angle to how life should be, compensating constantly, making do with less than ideal circumstances, creating elaborate workarounds for problems that shouldn't exist in the first place. And somehow, despite everything, despite the hostile floor and the crying window and the walls that betray all secrets, despite the 5-degree tilt and the thieving floorboards and the chamber pot placement anxiety, despite all of it, you're managing. You're surviving. You're home. If the slanted rooms are where boarding house residents endure their private struggles with geometry, the parlour is where they engage in their public struggles with each other. Not openly, obviously. That would be vulgar. But through carefully executed social manoeuvres, strategic furniture positioning, and occasional acts of biscuit-based diplomacy that would make international negotiators weep with envy. The parlour is theoretically neutral territory, a common space where all residents have equal access and equal rights. This is a beautiful democratic principle that lasts approximately until everyone actually tries to use the parlour simultaneously, at which point it becomes immediately clear that some people are considerably more equal than others. Welcome to Victorian social hierarchy, where even shared spaces have unspoken ranking systems that everyone understands and nobody acknowledges. The evening parlour rush begins around 7. after dinner service has concluded and people have retreated to their rooms just long enough to realise that sitting alone in a cold slanted room is depressing. The parlour has a fire, comfortable seating, gas lighting that actually works, and most importantly, the presence of other humans who might provide entertainment, or at least confirmation that you're not the only person living this particular version of working-class London existence. But the parlour has limited resources, specifically 1 fire and 8 chairs of varying quality. 13 residents. 8 chairs. 1 fire. This is not mathematics that works out in everyone's favour. Someone is going to be disappointed. Multiple someones, actually. The question is who gets disappointed and how gracefully they handle that disappointment. The warm chair is the crown jewel of parlour seating, the throne that every resident secretly covets, and some residents openly campaign for. It's positioned closest to the fire at the optimal angle for heat distribution, with arms that are worn smooth from generations of use and cushioning that hasn't completely given up on life. Sitting in the warm chair is a visceral experience of comfort that's almost shocking in a building where comfort is generally theoretical. Mrs. Young owns the warm chair through sheer force of seniority and the general understanding that challenging her claim would be social suicide. She's been here 5 years, pays her rent on time, never causes problems, and has achieved such legendary status that even Mrs. Hewitt defers to her occasionally. When Mrs. Young enters the parlour, people shift. Not obviously, not making a show of it, but shift nonetheless, creating space, acknowledging hierarchy, ensuring the warm chair is available. Except on Sunday nights after rent day, when the parlour briefly becomes democratised and whoever gets there first gets the warm chair. This creates interesting tactical situations. Mrs. Young could rush down immediately after dinner to claim her usual seat, but that would look desperate and beneath her dignity. She's developed a more elegant solution. She comes down exactly 15 minutes after dinner service ends, which is early enough that the chair is usually still available, but late enough that she's not appearing to compete for it. Usually this works perfectly. The first wave of parlour arrivals are generally younger residents who take whatever seating is available and are grateful for it. They're not competing for the warm chair because they know it's not really available to them regardless of Sunday night democracy. Social hierarchies don't actually disappear just because it's rent night. They just become slightly more flexible, like steel that's been heated but not melted. But sometimes someone miscalculates. Mr. Fletcher, who's still recovering his reputation from the bathroom flooding incident, made the terrible mistake 3 weeks ago of sitting in the warm chair on a Sunday night. He got there early, the chair was empty, technically it was available. He sat down with all the confidence of someone who doesn't understand that some rules are more important than other rules. The room got very quiet when Mrs. Young arrived. Fletcher, realising his error approximately 30 seconds too late, attempted to vacate the chair with some dignity. This failed because there's no dignified way to jump out of a chair like you've been electrocuted when everyone's watching. He mumbled something about needing to check on something upstairs and fled. Mrs. Young sat down without commenting, and Fletcher's already damaged reputation took another hit. Some mistakes compound. The other 7 chairs are also ranked, though less dramatically. The second best seat is the armchair by the window, which doesn't get direct fire heat but gets natural light and has decent cushioning. This usually goes to Morrison, not because he's high-ranking, but because he's reliable and non-threatening, the kind of person who can occupy good seating without anyone resenting it. He reads his newspaper in the window chair, occasionally making small observations about the news, contributing to parlour conversation without dominating it. The third and fourth best seats are the 2 chairs that flank the fire on the non-warm chair side. These get decent heat and have reasonable comfort. They're usually claimed by whoever's having a good week socially. Miss Perry gets one when she's in favour, which is most of the time because she's generally pleasant and occasionally brings her pocket supply of interesting food items to share. Mrs. Cardwell gets the other when her knees are bothering her, and everyone silently agrees she needs the fire more than they do. The middle-tier seating consists of 3 straight-back chairs that are functional but not comfortable, positioned far enough from the fire that you'll be vaguely aware of heat but not actually warm. These are where most residents end up most nights, and there's a complex negotiation about who sits where. The person who helped someone with something earlier that week might get the slightly better of the 3. The person who's been working the longest shift gets sympathetic consideration for the chair with the least broken support bar. The person who brought biscuits gets preferential treatment regardless of other factors. The worst seats are the 2 chairs closest to the door, which get no fire heat, catch all the draft when anyone enters or exits, and are positioned so you can't really see what's happening in the rest of the room without turning uncomfortably. These are penalty box seats, where people end up when they're new, when they've annoyed someone, or when they just had really bad timing in the parlour arrival sequence. You spent your first 2 weeks in the draft chairs, learning through cold shoulders, both literal and metaphorical, about parlour politics. But seating politics are just the opening act of parlour warfare. The real complexity comes in navigating parlour etiquette, which operates on rules that are never stated but absolutely enforced. First rule, you don't talk about money. The parlour is escape from the constant financial anxiety that defines boarding house existence. Nobody discusses rent, wages, debts, or economic struggles. These topics are radioactive, capable of destroying the evening's carefully maintained illusion that everyone's doing fine and this is all perfectly normal. Second rule, you don't bring up anyone's personal business unless they bring it up first. Everyone knows, Mr. Wickham talks to himself in his room. Nobody mentions this in the parlour because that would be acknowledging that the walls are thin, and we all hear everything, which would destroy the polite fiction of privacy. Everyone knows Fletcher flooded the bathroom. Mentioning it now would be cruel and pointless. The past stays in the past unless someone explicitly pulls it into the present. Third rule, complaints must be indirect. You don't say, Morrison, your kettle is too loud every night at 9:30 and it's driving me insane. You say, the pipes have been quite vocal lately, and Morrison, understanding the subtext, might adjust his evening tea timing by 15 minutes. Or he might not, if he decides his need for 9:30 tea outweighs your need for peace, which is his right and which you cannot challenge without appearing unreasonable. Fourth rule, generosity must appear spontaneous. If you've brought biscuits to share, you don't announce this like you're expecting gratitude. You casually mention you have extra biscuits. You couldn't possibly eat them all. Would anyone like some? This maintains the fiction that sharing is effortless rather than strategic, that you're not trading baked goods for social capital, even though that's absolutely what's happening. The biscuit economy in the parlour is particularly sophisticated, functioning as a complete currency system that operates parallel to the official rent-based economy. A good biscuit can buy forgiveness for minor infractions. 3 good biscuits can establish you as a valued community member. A truly exceptional biscuit, something with actual fruit or quality chocolate, can elevate your social status so dramatically that you'll get better seating for weeks. Miss Perry is the master of biscuit diplomacy, somehow producing quality baked goods on wages that barely cover rent and food. Nobody knows where she gets them. She works at a shop, possibly there's some kind of employee discount situation, possibly she's just extremely good at budget management. Either way, she shows up every couple weeks with something wrapped in paper, and the entire parlour perks up like dogs hearing a dinner bell. The distribution of Perry's biscuits is a masterclass in social awareness. Mrs. Young gets first choice, obviously, as tribute to the ranking system. Morrison gets second choice because he's reliable and shares coal. Mrs. Cardwell gets third choice because she's elderly, and everyone feels protective of her. Then it goes to whoever's done something helpful recently or who's having an obviously rough week. Fletcher gets his biscuit last, or sometimes not at all if the supply runs out, because his reputation is still in recovery, and biscuit distribution follows social standing. You received a Perry biscuit for the first time last week, which felt like a graduation ceremony. You'd helped her carry washing water from the pump when her arms were full, which was just basic human decency, but apparently it earned you a biscuit token. The biscuit was some kind of shortbread with lemon, probably homemade, definitely delicious, absolutely worth the social capital investment. You ate it slowly, aware that everyone was watching to see if you'd show appropriate gratitude, which you did by saying, "This is lovely, thank you," in a tone that conveyed appreciation without excessive enthusiasm. Food sharing in general is a delicate operation. Too generous and people suspect you're showing off or trying to buy favour. Not generous enough and you're marked as selfish. The perfect balance is offering to share something you genuinely have extra of, but making it clear this is special rather than expected. I managed to get an extra apple. Would anyone like half? Yes. I bought apples specifically to share with everyone. No. The first is generosity. The second is performance. The evening parlour routine follows a predictable pattern once everyone's seated and the social hierarchy has been established. Someone, usually Morrison, will mention something from the newspaper, opening a safe topic for general discussion. Politics are too controversial, personal matters too intimate, but general news about events in other parts of London or other parts of the world are acceptable conversation fodder. Says here they're expanding the underground, Morrison might observe, And this launches a 20-minute discussion about whether the underground is progress or madness, whether any of them would actually use it, whether it's safe to travel in tunnels underground like human moles. Nobody has strong opinions exactly, but everyone has thoughts, and sharing those thoughts fills time and creates the sensation of community. Mrs. Young occasionally contributes observations from her longer perspective, mentioning how things were different 10 years ago, how the neighbourhood has changed, how prices have risen. This is as close as anyone gets to discussing money in the parlour, these historical comparisons that acknowledge economic pressure without making it personal or immediate. Bread was cheaper before, Mrs. Young might say, and everyone nods knowingly, grateful that someone stated the obvious truth without making it depressing. Miss Perry sometimes shares gossip from the shop where she works, carefully sanitized of any details that might be indiscreet. A woman came in today asking about lace for a wedding dress, becomes a launching point for discussion about weddings, fashion, social expectations, what constitutes appropriate celebration. These conversations are comfortable because they're about hypothetical other people, not about anyone present who probably can't afford a wedding dress with lace. The Lewins participate carefully, always aware that drawing too much attention to themselves might invite questions about their living situation. They stick to safe topics, offer bland opinions, and generally try to be present without being memorable. It's a difficult balance, and they manage it well enough that most evenings nobody even thinks about their rule-breaking child situation. Griggs, when he joins the parlour gathering, usually brings a technical journal and reads silently, participating through presence rather than conversation. This is acceptable because he's established himself as the house eccentric, and eccentrics get special dispensation for antisocial behaviour. Also because nobody really wants to talk to someone whose primary characteristic is drinking onion tea, but that part goes unspoken. Fletcher tries too hard. He's still in reputation recovery mode, so he laughs too enthusiastically at others' mild jokes, agrees too readily with popular opinions, and generally performs eagerness to be accepted. This is painful to watch and probably counterproductive, but nobody tells him this because coaching someone on social performance would require acknowledging that social performance is happening, which would violate the unspoken rule about maintaining comfortable fictions. You're learning to navigate this system, figuring out when to speak and when to listen, when to offer opinions and when to just nod agreeably. You're somewhere in the middle of the hierarchy, not important enough to rate good seating automatically, but not so low that you're stuck in the draft chairs every night. You're working your way up through small acts of decent behaviour, occasional helpfulness, and strategic, not annoying people. The fire serves as the parlour's focal point and timekeeper. When the fire burns down and nobody volunteers to add more coal, that's the signal that the evening's ending. Usually this happens around 9:30 or 10, depending on how cold it is and how social everyone's feeling. Adding coal extends the evening, which is why someone adding coal without being asked is a generous act that gets noticed and remembered. Morrison usually adds coal once around 8:30 because he can afford to, and because it maintains his status as a reliable community contributor. Someone else might add coal around 9:15 if the evening's been particularly pleasant and nobody wants it to end yet. But if the fire dies and nobody moves to revive it, everyone understands. Time to retreat to cold rooms and another night of solo existence. The disbanding from the parlour follows reverse hierarchy. Mrs. Young leaves first because she can, her exit signalling that the evening has concluded successfully. Others follow in rough order of social standing, though this isn't rigid. Someone might leave early because they're tired without any social penalty. Someone might stay late hoping to have a quiet word with another resident about something practical, like borrowing tomorrow's newspaper or coordinating a shopping trip. The last person in the parlour is responsible for banking the fire, a small task that carries the weight of trust. You're being left alone with the communal fire and communal space, expected to handle it responsibly. This is usually Morrison or Mrs. Cardwell, people whose reliability is unquestioned. When you're eventually trusted with this task, you'll know you've achieved true acceptance in the house hierarchy. The parlour, for all its social complexity and unspoken warfare, serves a genuinely important function. It's proof that you're not entirely alone, that other people are struggling with the same things you're struggling with, that there's something resembling community, even if that community is mostly built on shared financial anxiety and architectural hostility. For a few hours most evenings, you're not just isolated workers living in separate slanted boxes. You're people, gathering around warmth, sharing space, creating the temporary illusion that life is manageable and perhaps even pleasant. You've learned to value parlour time, even when you're stuck in a draft chair with no biscuits and no particular standing. Because being cold and uncomfortable in the parlour with other people is genuinely better than being alone in your slanted room listening to Mr. Wickham argue with himself through the walls. The parlour offers heat, light, conversation, and the occasional biscuit. These are not small things. These are the small things that make boarding house life survivable rather than merely endured. Mrs. Hewitt sometimes joins the parlour gathering, though never for long. She sits in whichever chair happens to be available, which is always somehow vacated before she arrives, even though nobody appears to coordinate this. She observes without commanding, present without dominating, and her presence serves as a reminder that this is still her house, and these are still her rules, even during the evening hours when residents pretend at democracy. When Mrs. Hewitt leaves the parlour, always after exactly 15 minutes, the room relaxes slightly. Not that anyone was tense exactly, but her absence removes a layer of formality. Conversations become slightly more honest. Complaints become slightly more direct. Someone might mention that the breakfast porridge has been especially grim lately, which they'd never say while Mrs. Hewitt was present, but which everyone agrees about once she's gone. The parlour is teaching you things about community that you didn't know before moving here. How people create social structure even in the absence of official hierarchy. How small acts of generosity create debt and obligation in ways that maintain order. How sharing space requires constant negotiation and compromise. How comfort, even temporary comfort, becomes valuable enough to fight for in subtle, socially acceptable ways. You understand now why the warm chair matters so much. It's not just about being physically warm, though that's certainly part of it. It's about having a place, a status, a recognised position in the social order. It's about being the person who deserves the warm chair, who's earned it through time and good behaviour and consistent rent payment. It's a symbol that you've achieved something in a world where achievement is measured in not getting evicted and not dying of cold. Tonight you're in one of the middle chairs, not great but not terrible, close enough to the fire to feel occasional warmth when the flames surge. Miss Perry is doing needlework, humming very quietly. Morrison is reading about parliamentary proceedings with the focus of someone who finds politics genuinely interesting. Mrs. Cardwell is dozing slightly, her snoring just audible over the fire crackle. The Lewins are having a quiet conversation about something innocuous. Mrs. Young occupies the warm chair like a benevolent monarch, present but not interfering. This is community. Not chosen community. Not ideal community. Not the kind of heartwarming togetherness that gets written about in novels. But real community, built from necessity and proximity and shared experience of living in a house that's literally tilted against you. You're learning to appreciate it for what it is rather than mourning what it isn't. The fire burns lower. Nobody adds coal. The evening is ending naturally. Everyone tired from their various work days and ready to retreat to private space despite that space being cold and slanted and acoustically hostile. Mrs. Young rises first, nods to the room generally and departs. Others follow at intervals. You wait for your turn in the invisible queue, then stand, excuse yourself to the room at large and head for the stairs. Your slanted room awaits, with its crying window and thieving floor and walls that broadcast your every sound to curious neighbours. But you're returning to it warmer than you left, both physically from the parlour fire and socially from the evening's careful interactions. You participated in community. You navigated social hierarchy without major mistakes. You're becoming part of the house's ecosystem, learning its rhythms, adapting to its demands. Tomorrow the parlour warfare will resume. The warm chair will be contested through subtle manoeuvres. Biscuits may or may not appear. Social standing will shift based on who helped whom with what. The draft chairs will sit empty until someone with low standing or bad timing gets stuck there. The fire will burn and die and burn again. The complex dance of boarding house social life will continue, and you'll be part of it. Learning your steps, making your small moves, earning your place one evening at a time. The slant taught you about physics. The parlour is teaching you about politics. Both lessons are essential for survival in a Victorian boarding house, and both are significantly more complicated than they first appeared. But you're learning. Slowly, through repeated mistakes and occasional successes, you're learning. And that's really all anyone can do in a slanted house with complex social dynamics and a very competitive warm chair situation. Welcome to the parlour. Mind the hierarchy. Share your biscuits strategically. And for the love of everything, don't sit in Mrs. Young's chair unless it's a Sunday and you're absolutely certain of your timing. There's a moment in every boarding house resident's life when they realise that Mrs. Hewitt's official rules, posted on the wall by the front door in her precise handwriting, are actually the least important rules in the building. The real rules, the ones that determine whether you're going to survive here or become a cautionary tale, are never written down. They're transmitted through sideways glances, significant silences, and the occasional social catastrophe that serves as education for everyone watching. You learn this the hard way about 3 weeks in, when you make the critical error of using the kitchen kettle without refilling it afterward. This seems like a minor oversight, the kind of thing that might warrant a gentle reminder at most. Instead, it earns you 3 days of what can only be described as organised social coldness, where everyone's technically polite but somehow you end up last in every queue, your laundry mysteriously gets moved off the line, and nobody makes eye contact in the hallway. Nobody tells you what you did wrong. That would be direct confrontation, which is absolutely forbidden by the unspoken rules. Instead, Miss Perry mentions in the parlour that evening, to no one in particular, how exhausting it is when you're trying to make tea and have to fill the kettle first. Mrs. Cardwell agrees that yes, it's quite inconsiderate when people don't think about the next person. Morrison adds that he always fills the kettle after use. Always has. It's just common courtesy. The entire conversation happens around you, near you, somehow about you, without anyone actually looking at you or saying your name. This is how you learn the first and most important unspoken law: never accuse directly. Hint: imply. Speak in general terms about hypothetical situations that everyone understands are actually about specific real situations. Direct accusation causes confrontation, and confrontation disrupts the delicate social balance that keeps 13 people from murdering each other in close quarters. Indirect communication maintains plausible deniability while still conveying complete disapproval. The kettle incident teaches you a lesson that goes beyond remembering to refill water. It teaches you that every action in a boarding house has social consequences, that there's no such thing as a private mistake when you're living in other people's peripheral vision constantly, and that the punishment for breaking unspoken rules is coordinated social pressure that's more effective than any official sanction could be. You apologize indirectly, of course, because direct apology would be admitting you understood the indirect accusations, which would violate the whole system. Instead, you mention the next day, while making tea, how important it is to think about others in shared spaces. You make a visible show of filling the kettle all the way to the top. You leave it on the stove ready for the next person. Morrison witnesses this performance and gives a single nod of acknowledgement. The social freeze-thaws. You've learned your lesson and demonstrated understanding. Order is restored. The kettle rule, once you understand it, turns out to be part of a much larger principle. If you touch a communal resource, you leave it better than you found it. This applies to everything. The teapot gets refilled with fresh leaves if you use the last cup. The wash basin gets wiped down after use. The shared soap gets placed back on its dish, not left to dissolve in standing water. The parlour fire gets poked and adjusted if you've been enjoying its heat. These aren't requests, they're obligations, and failing them marks you as someone who takes without giving back. But there's a delicate balance to maintain. You can't be too helpful, too eager to fix things, too obviously trying to compensate for earlier mistakes. That reads as performative and insincere, which might be worse than the original infraction. Your helpfulness has to appear natural, unconsidered, the automatic behaviour of someone who was raised properly and simply thinks this way without effort. You have to care enough to maintain communal resources, but not so much that you draw attention to yourself caring. Fletcher, still struggling with his reputation after the bathroom flooding incident, makes this mistake regularly. He overcorrects. He fills the kettle too enthusiastically to the point where it's heavy and awkward. He tidies the parlour too thoroughly, rearranging things that were fine where they were. He offers to help with tasks that don't need additional hands. His helpfulness screams, "I'm trying to make you like me," instead of "I'm naturally considerate," and somehow this makes things worse. The house doesn't trust transparent desperation. You're learning to calibrate your helpfulness to appear effortless. When you fill the kettle, you do it while doing something else, like you barely noticed you were doing it. When you wipe down the basin, you make it look like you're just tidying up after yourself, not performing cleaning service for others. When you poke the parlour fire, you do it while getting up to leave anyway, a casual gesture rather than dedicated fire maintenance. The art is making thoughtfulness look thoughtless. The second major unspoken law you learn is about property boundaries in a space where privacy is theoretical. Someone's belongings, even if left in communal areas, are absolutely untouchable without explicit permission. This seems obvious until you realise it extends to things like newspapers, where you might reasonably assume a paper left in the parlour is available for general reading. It's not. That's Morrison's paper, even if Morrison isn't currently reading it, even if it's 3 days old, even if it's lying on a chair that Morrison isn't sitting in. You learned this by picking up Morrison's paper one evening when the parlour was empty, figuring you'd read it and put it back before anyone noticed. Morrison noticed immediately upon entering, even though you'd replaced the paper in exactly its original position. The look he gave you wasn't angry exactly, more disappointed, which somehow felt worse. You apologised directly this time because the infraction was serious enough to warrant breaking the indirect communication rule. Morrison accepted the apology and offered to share his paper after he's finished with it, which was generous given that you'd violated his property rights. The property rule extends in weird ways. Mrs. Cardwell's chair in the parlour isn't officially her chair, but it's her chair, and sitting in it when she's expected would be unconscionable. Miss Perry's spot at the breakfast table isn't assigned, but it's hers, and taking it would cause offence even though there's no written seating chart. Griggs's shelf in the kitchen for his cursed onion supply is sacrosanct, even though shelves are theoretically communal. These invisible boundaries are more real than walls. But property rules have strange exceptions for emergencies. If someone's in genuine trouble, their belongings become communal resources that can be deployed for their benefit. When Miss Perry was ill last month, Mrs. Cardwell went into Perry's room without asking and brought down her shawl to wrap her in. This would normally be a severe violation, but because it was done in service of Perry's well-being, it was not only acceptable, but expected. The house has collective responsibility for its members, overriding individual property rights when someone's actually suffering. The third unspoken law governs information flow, which is complicated because the walls broadcast everything, but you're supposed to pretend you don't hear. You know Morrison's kettle schedule. You know Mr. Wickham talks to himself. You know the Lewins have a secret child. You know Mrs. Cardwell does morning calisthenics. But acknowledging any of this knowledge would be admitting that privacy doesn't exist, which would make living here psychologically unbearable for everyone. So you develop selective hearing and strategic ignorance. When Mr. Wickham's evening self-conversations come through the walls, you don't hear them. When the Lewins' child cries in the night, nobody heard anything. When someone's having a difficult personal moment that's audible through the pipes, everyone develops sudden temporary deafness. Information gained through architectural eavesdropping is privileged information that must be actively forgotten for the sake of communal dignity. But this creates interesting situations where everyone knows something, everyone knows everyone else knows, and yet discussing it remains forbidden. The Lewins' child situation is the perfect example. Mrs. Hewitt obviously knows. All the residents obviously know. The child himself probably knows that everyone knows. And yet the polite fiction of family visiting frequently must be maintained because breaking that fiction would require Mrs. Hewitt to enforce the no children rule, which would result in the Lewins being evicted, which nobody actually wants because they're good tenants who pay rent on time and don't cause problems beyond the minor rule violation that everyone's agreed to ignore. This is Victorian social architecture at its finest, creating complex systems of collective delusion that allow people to violate rules while maintaining everyone's dignity. The child doesn't live here, he visits. Mrs. Cardwell doesn't have a canary. Those singing sounds are just her unusual laugh. Griggs isn't strange, he's just particular about his tea preferences. Everyone's lying, everyone knows everyone's lying, and the lies are more important than the truth because the lies preserve order. The fourth unspoken law is about kindness, and it's the most counterintuitive rule in the entire building. Kindness must be anonymous. Generosity must be deniable. Help must be offered in ways that allow the recipient to pretend they didn't need help. This seems bizarre until you understand that working-class Victorian pride is a fragile thing, easily damaged, and that accepting charity can be more humiliating than going without. You see this play out in small ways constantly. Someone's short on coal and mysteriously their scuttle has more in it than they remember. Someone's struggling to afford proper meals and somehow the breakfast porridge portions get larger without explanation. Someone's clothes need mending and they find their torn shirt returned to their room with the rips fixed. No note, no acknowledgement. The house takes care of its own, but it does so secretly, maintaining the fiction that everyone's managing fine independently. When you first tried to help Mrs. Cardwell carry her shopping up the stairs, directly offering assistance, she refused with enough ice in her voice to cool the entire building. This was confusing until Miss Perry explained later, indirectly of course, that some people prefer their struggles to remain private. The correct approach would have been to happen to be going upstairs at the same time, mention you're heading that way anyway, and offer to take one bag since you're going in that direction, and it's no trouble. This allows Mrs. Cardwell to accept help without accepting charity, maintaining her independence while still getting assistance. You're learning this dance, help that doesn't look like helping, support that maintains dignity, kindness that allows the recipient to believe they didn't need it. It's exhausting and complicated and probably inefficient by any rational standard, but it's how this community functions without anyone having to admit they're vulnerable. The anonymous kindness rule creates interesting situations where good deeds become mysteries. You left an extra candle in Morrison's room when you noticed his supply was low, making sure to do it while he was out so he wouldn't know it was you. Someone, probably Mrs. Cardwell, mended a tear in your work shirt and returned it to your room while you were at breakfast. Miss Perry's been finding small amounts of sugar in her tea tin that she definitely didn't put there. Contributions from someone who noticed she's been going without to save money. These acts of anonymous support create a web of mutual aid that's never acknowledged, but that keeps everyone from falling completely through the economic cracks. You're all poor. You're all struggling. But you're not all struggling simultaneously in all the same ways, so whoever's doing slightly better this week helps whoever's doing slightly worse, and next week it might reverse, and the month after that it'll shift again. The anonymity is crucial because it prevents debt, obligation, and the power dynamics that come with acknowledged charity. But you have to be careful with anonymous kindness because it can backfire spectacularly. Fletcher tried to anonymously leave biscuits in the parlour as an offering to improve his reputation. Unfortunately, he left them on Morrison's usual chair, which made it look like Morrison had provided the biscuits. Morrison got credit for Fletcher's generosity. Fletcher got no social rehabilitation, and the whole thing probably set his reputation recovery back another month. Anonymous kindness requires strategic thinking about placement, timing, and plausible deniability. The fifth unspoken law governs conflict resolution, and it's basically, don't. Just don't have conflict. Ever. If someone's bothering you, you don't confront them about it. You mention general principles in their vicinity until they understand and modify their behaviour. If that doesn't work, you escalate to coordinated social pressure from multiple people. If that still doesn't work, you involve Mrs. Hewitt by making observations she can't ignore, forcing her to address the situation officially. Direct confrontation is the nuclear option, reserved for violations so severe that social cohesion is already broken. The bathroom flooding incident was serious enough that Mrs. Hewitt had to confront Fletcher directly, issuing a formal warning that went in the ledger. But that's rare. Most conflicts are resolved through the complex system of hints, implications, and strategic parlour conversations that make everyone's displeasure known without anyone actually saying they're displeased. This creates a lot of passive aggression, obviously. You can't just tell someone they're annoying you, so you find indirect ways to express frustration. You adjust your schedule to avoid them. You stop making eye contact. You exclude them from parlour conversations by directing all remarks to other people. You forget to mention useful information that would benefit them. It's all very juvenile and also completely necessary for maintaining peace in tight quarters. The house has developed a collective expertise in reading tiny social signals. A slight change in Morrison's newspaper reading posture means he's annoyed about something. Miss Perry humming in a minor key indicates distress. Mrs. Cardwell, sitting more upright than usual, signals strong opinions about recent events. The Lewins speaking more quietly means their child is being particularly difficult. You learn these signals like a language, becoming fluent in the minute expressions of boarding house emotion. The sixth unspoken law is about resources during scarcity, which is most of the time. When something's in short supply, the rule is, take only what you absolutely need, and if there's not enough for everyone, the hierarchy determines distribution. This applies to everything from hot water to firewood to the last piece of bread. Hot water Mondays and Fridays creates particularly interesting resource dynamics. There's technically enough hot water for everyone if everyone's reasonable about usage. Except people aren't always reasonable, and someone taking a slightly longer wash means someone else gets lukewarm water instead of hot. The unspoken rule is that senior residents get first access to the hottest water. Mrs. Young could theoretically use all the hot water and nobody could object. She doesn't because she's not a monster, but she could. You're low enough in the hierarchy that you get hot water after about 6 other people have used it, which means your hot water is more aggressively warm at best. But you don't complain because complaining about your rightful place in the resource distribution hierarchy would be questioning the entire social order. You just wait your turn, use your lukewarm water quickly, and hope that next year you'll have enough seniority to get actually hot water. The coal situation is similar. Everyone needs coal, not everyone can afford enough coal, so there's a complicated sharing arrangement that operates on principles of reciprocity and social standing. Morrison shares coal freely because he can afford to, and because it maintains his position as a reliable community member. You share coal occasionally when you can afford to, establishing yourself as willing to participate in the mutual aid economy. Fletcher doesn't share coal because he can't afford to, and also because his reputation means people don't expect generosity from him anyway. The seventh unspoken law might be the most important. You don't leave the house looking poor. This seems contradictory because everyone is poor, demonstrably, paying 5 shillings a week to live in slanted rooms with crying windows. But there's a difference between being poor and looking poor, and maintaining that distinction is apparently worth significant effort and expense. Everyone has their outside clothes and their inside clothes. Inside clothes can be worn, stained, patched, held together with hope and strategic pinning. But outside clothes must look respectable, even if maintaining that respectability requires spending money you don't have on things like collar starch and boot blacking. The house's reputation depends on residents looking like respectable working people rather than desperate charity cases, and everyone takes this responsibility seriously. You've learned to do most of your clothes maintenance yourself, saving the expense of professional laundry or repairs. Hemming your own trousers, sewing buttons back on, attempting to iron your shirt using a flat piece of metal heated on the stove, which works about as well as you'd expect, meaning poorly but better than nothing. These are skills you never thought you'd need, but that turn out to be essential for maintaining the appearance of being someone who doesn't live in a room where the floor steals your possessions. The eighth unspoken law is about illness, and it's brutal in its practicality. If you're sick, you isolate and you don't burden others with your symptoms. This isn't callousness, it's survival. If illness spreads through the boarding house, people miss work. If people miss work, they can't pay rent. If they can't pay rent, they get evicted. Therefore, illness must be contained and minimised and definitely not discussed in communal spaces. When Miss Perry was ill last month, she stayed in her room for 3 days, coming out only for absolute necessities, minimising contact with other residents. Nobody complained about this isolation because everyone understood it was protecting them. People left food outside her door, anonymously of course. Someone made sure there was fresh water available. Mrs. Hewitt quietly reduced her rent that week because Perry couldn't make it to breakfast and dinner. But all of this happened without acknowledgement, maintaining the fiction that Perry was fine and just choosing to stay in her room. The alternative, coming to breakfast visibly ill and potentially contagious, would have been socially unacceptable to the point of generating real anger. The house depends on everyone staying healthy enough to work. Risking that for the sake of not missing meals would be prioritising individual comfort over collective welfare. The social contract requires you to suffer privately to protect the group. The ninth unspoken law governs borrowing, and it's more complex than just return things you borrow. First, you only borrow in genuine need, not for convenience. Second, you return items promptly and in better condition than you received them. Third, you never borrow the same thing twice without offering something in return. Fourth, some things are never borrowable under any circumstances, even in emergency. Newspaper is borrowable after the owner has finished with it, typically on a 2-day delay. Sugar is borrowable in small quantities for specific purposes, with repayment expected but timing flexible. Candles are borrowable only in actual emergency, like if your candle went out and you need light to deal with something urgent. Soap is theoretically borrowable but practically too intimate to actually borrow. Clothing is absolutely never borrowable under any circumstances, even if you're the same size and really need something for a specific occasion. You borrowed Morrison's newspaper once, after he'd finished with it, and returned it the next day with a small packet of tea as thanks. This was probably excessive, the tea was worth more than the newspaper rental, but you're still building reputation, and over-generosity is safer than under-generosity when you're establishing patterns. Morrison accepted the tea with a nod that suggested he understood you were making a gesture about being a good borrower generally, not just thanking him for one newspaper specifically. The 10th unspoken law is about personal space in a building where personal space doesn't physically exist. The rule is, you acknowledge people's psychological boundaries even when their physical boundaries are permeated by sound and smell. You knock before entering rooms, even though you can hear everything that happens in those rooms anyway. You avert your eyes when someone's having a private moment in a communal space, even though you're 3 feet away and avoidance is impossible. You pretend not to notice things that you absolutely notice. This creates elaborate theatre where everyone's constantly performing not noticing. You don't notice that Fletcher is crying quietly in the parlour corner. You don't notice that Mrs. Cardwell's hands shake when she's tired. You don't notice that the Lewins had an argument this morning that was audible through multiple floors. You don't notice anything that people would prefer you not notice, and they extend you the same courtesy, not noticing your moments of struggle or embarrassment. The not noticing is harder than it sounds because humans are wired to notice things, especially in close quarters where everyone's behavior affects everyone else. You have to actively train yourself to see things and then immediately forget them, to hear things and erase them from memory, to be aware of information and then behave as if you're not. It's exhausting. It's also essential for maintaining everyone's dignity in conditions that would otherwise strip dignity away completely. The 11th unspoken law is about gratitude, and it's surprisingly strict. You acknowledge help, but briefly and without effusion. Excessive thanks makes everyone uncomfortable because it highlights the fact that help was needed, which violates the pride preservation principle. The correct response to someone's kindness is a simple thank you, or even just a nod of acknowledgement, then moving on as if the help was so natural and expected that dwelling on it would be strange. When Mrs. Cardwell mended your shirt, you thanked her briefly the next time you saw her. She nodded, and that was the end of it. The entire exchange took maybe 5 seconds. This seems cold compared to the elaborate gratitude you might express in a different social context. But here, brief acknowledgement shows respect for both the help given and the recipient's dignity. Lengthy thanks would suggest you found the help remarkable, which would imply you're not normally worthy of help, which would be insulting to yourself and awkward for everyone. The 12th unspoken law is about money, and we touched on this earlier, but it bears repeating. You never discuss your financial situation specifically. You can mention general economic conditions. You can participate in abstract conversations about wages and living costs. But you never say, I can't afford this, or I'm short on rent, or I haven't eaten properly in 3 days. Those admissions would make you vulnerable in ways that are dangerous in a community where reputation determines treatment. Instead, you indicate financial stress through other means. Skipping meals that you can skip, wearing your second best clothes more often, finding excuses to avoid optional expenses like parlour coal contributions, accepting offers of help that you'd normally decline. People who are paying attention understand these signals and respond accordingly, offering anonymous assistance or creating opportunities for you to earn extra through the favour economy. But nothing's discussed directly because direct discussion would require acknowledging poverty in ways that make maintaining dignity impossible. The 13th unspoken law is about departure, and it's the saddest one. When someone leaves, you don't ask why or where they're going. People leave boarding houses for many reasons. Better opportunities, usually. Sometimes worse circumstances. Occasionally because they've died, though the house prefers to avoid deaths on the premises because that affects rental prospects. Whatever the reason, departure is treated as a natural event that requires no explanation. You've seen 2 people leave since you moved in. One left a note thanking Mrs. Hewitt and left their key on the hall table. The other just disappeared one day, their room empty, their entry in the ledger crossed out with departed without notice noted. Both departures were discussed in the parlour for maybe 10 minutes. General observations about how the person seemed nice enough or how their room will probably go quickly. Then the departed person became past tense, their absence absorbed into the house's ongoing present without much ceremony. This seems cold until you understand that dwelling on departures would be dwelling on the instability that defines boarding house existence. People come and go constantly. Forming deep attachments would be emotionally exhausting when those attachments keep leaving. Better to maintain friendly distance, acknowledge departure briefly, and continue with the business of surviving in close quarters with whoever happens to be here now. All of these unspoken laws combine into a complete social operating system that's more sophisticated than any written rule set could be. You're learning to navigate it through repeated trial and error, watching how others behave, paying attention to the subtle corrections that happen when you misstep. The learning curve is steep and the penalties for violations are socially painful, but eventually you start to internalize the patterns. You find yourself automatically refilling the kettle, not because you're consciously remembering the rule, but because it's become habit. You find yourself helping anonymously without planning to, just noticing opportunities and taking them in ways that maintain deniability. You find yourself participating in the collective fiction about the Lewins child and Mrs. Cardwell's canary without thinking about it, the lies becoming comfortable and natural. You're becoming socialized into boarding house culture, learning to read the room with the skill of someone whose social survival depends on accurate interpretation of minimal signals. You can tell when the house is collectively annoyed with someone, even if nobody says anything explicit. You can feel when social pressure is building toward an intervention. You can sense when the mood is good enough that minor rule violations will be overlooked, versus when everyone's stressed and enforcement will be strict. This cultural fluency is your real security in the boarding house, more valuable than the rent you pay or the key to your room. As long as you understand and follow the unspoken laws, you're part of the community. You'll be protected by anonymous kindness when you struggle. You'll be included in the mutual aid economy. You'll get the benefit of doubt when you make mistakes. The house will accept you as one of its own, for as long as you maintain your understanding of how things work here. But break enough unspoken laws, or break them badly enough, and you'll find yourself in Fletcher's position, technically allowed to stay but socially isolated, paying full rent for diminished belonging, working twice as hard for half the acceptance that others receive easily. The house has ways of making life uncomfortable for people who don't fit in, and those ways are more effective than any official punishment could be. You're learning to follow the unspoken laws not just because breaking them has consequences, but because they actually make sense. These rules developed over years, maybe decades, through countless residents trying to figure out how to live together in impossible circumstances. They're refined through trial and error, optimized for minimizing conflict and maximizing collective survival. They're not always fair or logical or emotionally satisfying, but they work. The unspoken laws are how 13 people share one bathroom without murder, how they share limited resources without constant fighting, how they maintain individual dignity while living in conditions that should strip away all privacy and pride, how they create community among people who would otherwise be strangers united only by shared economic desperation. The laws are the invisible architecture that makes the boarding house function as something more than just a building full of separate miserable people. Every day you navigate these laws more smoothly, making fewer mistakes, reading situations more accurately, participating in the elaborate social dance with increasing confidence. You're learning when to speak and when to stay silent, when to help and when to let people struggle privately, when to notice things and when to perform careful blindness, when to be part of the collective and when to maintain strategic distance. You've become fluent in indirect communication, able to convey complex messages through implication and inference. You can hint at your needs without stating them. You can offer help without making it seem like help. You can correct others' behavior without direct confrontation. You can participate in conflicts without creating enemies. These are skills that will serve you well beyond the boarding house, social competencies that transfer to any situation where people must navigate complex hierarchies with limited resources. The unspoken laws have made you a better observer of human behavior, more sensitive to subtle social signals, more aware of the elaborate systems people create to manage life in difficult circumstances. You understand now that rules posted on walls are usually the least important rules, that the real governance happens through informal mechanisms, and that social pressure is often more powerful than official authority. You've also learned that kindness works best when it's anonymous, that help is most effective when it preserves dignity, and that the strongest communities are often held together by elaborate fictions that everyone agrees to believe. The Victorian boarding house has taught you that sometimes lies are more valuable than truth, that indirect communication can be more honest than direct confrontation, and that survival in close quarters requires sophisticated emotional intelligence. These lessons will stay with you long after you leave the boarding house, assuming you eventually leave. They're the real education you're getting here, more valuable than anything you might learn at work, more practical than any formal schooling. You're learning how humans actually function in difficult circumstances, how communities maintain themselves under pressure, how social systems emerge from necessity and persist through habit. The unspoken laws are making you into a better resident, a more considerate human, and possibly a more exhausted person because constantly monitoring social signals and navigating indirect communication is tiring. But it's working. You're part of the house now. You belong here, at least for now, at least while you can pay rent and follow the rules both spoken and unspoken. Welcome to boarding house citizenship. Fill the kettle after use. Help anonymously. Never borrow soap. Don't ask why people are leaving. Maintain the fiction about the Lewin's child. Pretend not to notice things you definitely notice. And whatever you do, don't sit and misses. Young's chair, don't flood the bathroom, and don't try Griggs's onion tea even if he offers, which he won't, because that would violate approximately 7 unspoken laws simultaneously. Behind the boarding house, accessible through a narrow door in the kitchen that's always slightly ajar but never fully open, lies a space that doesn't appear on any official rental agreement, and yet might be the most important square footage in the entire building. The back passage, the yard, the alley, Whatever you want to call this strip of paved ground that's maybe 15 feet wide and 30 feet long, hemmed in by the back walls of surrounding buildings like a canyon made of brick and questionable Victorian construction decisions. This is where the real economy of the boarding house happens, and by real economy I mean the one that operates entirely outside Mrs. Hewitt's ledger, outside the formal rent and breakfast arrangement, outside any official recognition. This is the black market of tenderness, the informal trading floor where things are exchanged according to rules that have nothing to do with money and everything to do with need, timing, and the complex web of mutual obligation that keeps poor people from drowning in their poverty. You discover the back passage exists about 2 weeks into your residency, when you follow Miss Perry through the kitchen one evening and find yourself in this unexpected space. It's not exactly pleasant. The paving stones are uneven, creating puddles that never fully drain. The walls are spotted with damp and something that might be mould, or might be some kind of evolutionary advancement in wall decay. There's a permanent smell of old water, coal dust, and whatever the neighbours are cooking, which today appears to be something involving cabbage and regret. But the back passage has advantages that outweigh its aesthetic shortcomings. It's semi-private, visible only to residents of the surrounding buildings who all have their own back passages and their own informal economies happening. It's outside, which means conversations here don't get broadcast through the house's acoustic surveillance system. And most importantly, it's where people gather in the evenings when the weather's tolerably not raining, creating a space for interactions that would be impossible in the formal zones of the house. There's a washing line strung across the passage at head height, which you discover by walking directly into it on your first visit. Nobody warns you about the line because finding it yourself is apparently a rite of passage. The line is constantly in use, clothing and linens hanging like flags declaring everyone's laundry situation to anyone who passes through. You can tell a lot about a person from their washing. Mrs. Cardwell's items are meticulously mended, everything patched and repatched with the kind of careful needlework that suggests she'd rather repair than replace. Morrison's clothes are practical and worn thin but clean. Miss Perry's things include surprisingly nice handkerchiefs with embroidered edges, a small luxury she's apparently maintained despite economic constraints. The Lewins' washing includes very small items that are definitely children's clothing, displayed here openly even though upstairs everyone maintains the fiction that no child lives in this building. The back passage operates under different rules than the house proper. What's unspoken upstairs can be acknowledged here, in the liminal space between public and private, official and unofficial. Along one wall, someone has created a makeshift shelving system using old crates and planks, creating storage that's technically communal, but practically divided into invisible territories that everyone respects. This is where the trading happens, where items appear and disappear according to a system that takes weeks to understand and months to fully participate in. The first time you see an actual trade negotiation is between Miss Perry and Mrs. Cardwell, and it's unlike any commercial transaction you've witnessed. Perry has somehow acquired a lemon, a whole lemon, which in Victorian working-class London is approximately as valuable as a small gemstone. She's offering half the lemon to Mrs. Cardwell in exchange for some mending services. But the negotiation isn't about terms, it's about making sure both parties can accept the exchange without feeling like charity is happening. I couldn't possibly use a whole lemon, Perry says, which might even be true but is definitely tactical. It'll go off before I can finish it. I do have some mending that needs attention, Cardwell responds, examining the lemon like she's considering whether this is a fair trade, when obviously a lemon for some basic sewing is wildly in Perry's favour. I suppose that would work out well for both of us. The exchange happens, both parties pretending this is a simple transaction between equals rather than Perry finding a way to give Cardwell a lemon while preserving everyone's dignity. This is the art of back passage trading, making generosity look like commerce, making help look like convenience, making kindness look like coincidence. You start paying attention to the shelving system, trying to decode what's being traded and how the system works. Items appear with small marks or positioning that indicates they're available for trade. A bottle of ink with the cork slightly raised. A spool of thread placed at the front of a shelf. A pair of shoelaces draped over the edge of a crate. These signals mean available for exchange to people who know the system. The pricing is entirely subjective and based on need rather than market value. A pencil might trade for a significant amount of sugar if the person needing the pencil is desperate and the person with sugar is doing fine. Or it might trade for almost nothing if circumstances are reversed. Everything's negotiable. Nothing has fixed value. The currency is need, and need fluctuates constantly based on employment, health, weather, and pure chance. You watch Morrison trade a small amount of tobacco to Mr. Wickham in exchange for Wickham doing some calculations for him. Morrison doesn't smoke. He acquired the tobacco somehow specifically for trading purposes, understanding that tobacco has high exchange value. Wickham needs tobacco, but also needs to feel like he's earning it rather than accepting charity. So the calculation work provides cover for what's essentially Morrison giving Wickham tobacco, because Wickham's been having a rough month. The back passage economy includes items you wouldn't expect to be tradable. Someone's trading sketches, hand-drawn portraits and scenes in exchange for food items. You discover the artist is young Mr. Fletcher, and this is apparently his reputation rehabilitation strategy. He can't buy his way back into social acceptance, but he can draw his way there, providing people with small luxuries they can't afford otherwise. The sketches are actually quite good, careful pencil work that captures personality in a few lines. Fletcher draws Miss Perry looking younger and prettier than she probably looks in reality, and she's so delighted that she gives him not only the agreed-upon payment of an apple, but also an extra biscuit unsolicited. This is how Fletcher's reputation is slowly healing, one drawing at a time. You start participating in the back passage economy carefully, beginning with small trades that establish you as someone who understands how the system works. You trade a button that you don't need for a length of string that you do need. You trade some writing paper for a stub of wax candle. These initial trades are tests, making sure you understand the unspoken rules about fair exchange, about maintaining dignity, about never making the other person feel like they got the worse end of the deal. Then you get more ambitious. You manage to acquire a small orange somehow, possibly from a street vendor who was desperate to sell at the end of the day, possibly through means you'd rather not examine too closely. The orange is slightly bruised but basically fine, and in the back passage economy it's treasure. You could eat it yourself, obviously, but eating it would give you one orange's worth of enjoyment. Trading it could get you significantly more value in social capital and practical resources. You place the orange on the communal shelf with a specific positioning that indicates availability for trade, then retreat to your room to see what happens. This is the interesting part of back passage economics. You don't negotiate directly for your own items. You make them available and let people approach you with offers, maintaining the fiction that you're not desperately trying to trade your orange for literally anything useful. Miss Perry comes to your room that evening, knocks quietly, and mentions that she noticed the orange and would you possibly be interested in trading it for some sewing services she's been meaning to offer anyway, and also she has extra tea that she couldn't possibly use all of, and perhaps some fresh bread from the bakery where she works. Just the end pieces that they were going to discard anyway. Not charity, obviously, just practical distribution of resources. This is a wildly generous offer for one slightly bruised orange. Perry is clearly having a good week and using the orange trade as an excuse to help you without making it look like help. You accept with appropriate casualness, mentioning that yes, you do have some items that need mending, and tea would be useful, and the bread ends would save you money that you'd otherwise spend on bread. Everyone's pretending this is a fair trade when it's actually Perry being kind in ways that let you accept kindness. The mending, tea and bread appear in your room the next day while you're at work, left without fanfare or expectation of additional gratitude beyond the thank you you'll offer next time you see Perry. This is back passage economics at its finest. The orange was just a token that allowed a transfer of resources from someone doing better to someone doing worse, disguised as commerce so nobody's pride gets damaged. You start understanding that the back passage isn't just where trading happens, it's where the house's emotional economy gets sorted out. Grievances that can't be addressed upstairs get resolved in the passage. Someone who's been annoying in the house proper can rehabilitate themselves with strategic trades in the passage. Social standings shift based on generosity, cleverness, and the quality of items you're able to acquire for trading. The back passage also serves as the house's informal information exchange. News that would be gossip if shared in the parlour becomes community intelligence in the passage. Someone mentions that their employer is hiring. Someone else mentions that a shop on the corner has day-old bread for reduced prices. Someone shares that the coal merchant on High Street is cheaper than the usual supplier. This information sharing is valuable, potentially saving residents significant money or creating employment opportunities, but it happens casually, like weather observations rather than strategic intelligence briefing. Mrs. Hewitt herself participates in the back passage economy, though she'd never acknowledged this officially. She operates through proxies and strategic ignorance, placing items on the communal shelves without marking them as hers, allowing residents to trade for them without the awkwardness of trading with their landlady. You recognise her contributions because they're slightly too nice, slightly too new to have come from any resident's limited resources. A full cake of good soap, a bundle of quality candles, a bag of sugar that's definitely refined rather than the brown stuff most people can afford. Mrs. Hewitt's back passage contributions serve multiple purposes. They help residents who are struggling without the humiliation of direct charity. They create goodwill that makes rent collection easier. And they give her intelligence about who's trading what with whom, information that probably influences her ledger notations and her assessment of residents' financial situations. The passage economy isn't separate from the official house economy. It's a parallel system that provides Mrs. Hewitt with additional data about her tenants. You realise that Mrs. Hewitt's apparent strictness about house rules is balanced by her facilitation of the back passage economy. She could shut down the informal trading. She could claim that the back passage is part of the rental property and charge for access or monitor it more strictly. Instead, she lets it operate with minimal interference, understanding that the informal economy is what makes the formal rent payments possible. If residents couldn't trade with each other, couldn't help each other, couldn't create this web of mutual support, they'd be less able to consistently make rent. The back passage economy is actually protecting her rental income while allowing her to maintain the fiction of running a strictly managed boarding house. The passage also functions as the house's weather vane for morale and financial health. When lots of trading is happening, when the communal shelves are full of items available for exchange, when people are lingering in the passage chatting and negotiating, that means the house is doing relatively well. When the shelves are bare, when people rush through without stopping, when trades are fewer and more desperate, that means residents are collectively struggling. Mrs. Hewitt can probably predict rent collection difficulties just by observing passage activity. The passage has unwritten rules that are different from the house's unwritten rules, but equally strict. First rule, what happens in the passage stays in the passage. Information about who traded what with whom is private. You don't mention upstairs that you saw Fletcher trading his drawings for food. You don't comment in the parlour about the Lewins' child's clothing hanging on the line. The passage is a cone of silence that allows people to do what they need to do without facing judgment in the formal spaces of the house. Second rule, trades must be genuinely fair or weighted in favour of the person in greater need. You can't exploit someone's desperation. You can't demand excessive payment from someone who's struggling. The community monitors this through gossip and social pressure. Someone who makes unfair trades gets a reputation that makes future trading difficult. The system self-regulates through collective enforcement of fairness principles. Third rule, you never refuse a trade without good reason, and I don't want to isn't a good reason. Refusing trades damages the social fabric, suggests you're not participating in the mutual aid economy, marks you as someone who's either too proud or too selfish to be part of the community. Obviously, you can refuse trades that are genuinely problematic or that you can't fulfill, but casual refusal is socially costly. Fourth rule, everything's negotiable. The initial terms of a trade are just an opening position. Both parties are expected to adjust, to add small extras, to make the deal work better for both sides. A trade for mending might include, "Oh, and I had some extra buttons that didn't match anything, you might as well take them." A trade for food might include, "I made too much tea and couldn't drink it all before it got cold, would you like it?" These extras aren't required, but they're appreciated and they improve the trader's reputation. You're learning to be a good trader, which means being fair, being generous when you can afford to be, and being honest about what you need versus what you just want. You've established yourself as someone who trades in good faith, who doesn't try to cheat on valuations, who throws in little extras when possible. This reputation is making your life in the boarding house significantly easier because people are more willing to help you, more likely to offer trades that benefit you, more inclined to share information about opportunities. The passage also serves social functions beyond economics. It's where people have conversations that would be impossible in the house proper. Private conversations, not private in the sense of being unheard, but private in the sense of being separated from the house's formal social structure. You can complain about Mrs. Hewitt in the passage in ways you'd never complain upstairs. You can be more honest about financial struggles. You can admit to loneliness or homesickness or frustration with your job. The passage is confession space, therapy space, and community space all at once. Mr. Wickham, who's silent and strange upstairs, is surprisingly talkative in the passage. He shares stories about his work, his past, his opinions on current events. The informal setting relaxes something in him, allows him to be more human and less mysterious. You learn that he talks to himself upstairs because he's lonely, because he moved to London from a small village and misses having people to talk to. The passage gives him that human contact in a space where it's safe to be more open. Miss Perry uses the passage to teach younger residents practical skills, showing them how to mend clothes, how to stretch food supplies, how to recognize good bargains versus false economies. She does this casually while hanging laundry or arranging trades, but it's definitely intentional teaching. She's passing on working-class survival knowledge that isn't written in any manual, but that's essential for making it in London on insufficient wages. The Lewins sometimes bring their not-officially living here child to the passage, letting him play in the open air under the pretense that he's just visiting and needed some outdoor time. Other residents pretend not to notice but actually keep subtle watch, making sure the child doesn't get into anything dangerous. The collective fiction about the child's existence requires collective participation in protecting him, and the passage is where that protection happens openly, while still maintaining the upstairs fiction. Morrison uses the passage to smoke his pipe, which he doesn't do in his room because of fire risk and doesn't do in the parlour because not everyone appreciates pipe smoke. The passage is neutral territory where he can stand, smoke, think, and occasionally offer wisdom to residents who seek him out. He's become an informal counsellor, listening to problems and offering practical advice that's more useful than sympathy. People trade him tobacco or tea or small favours in exchange for his counsel, though nobody frames it that way. They're just trading, and conversation happens to occur during the transaction. Mrs. Cardwell sits in the passage on nice evenings, doing her needlework by fading daylight, available for conversation but not demanding it. Her presence is calming somehow, a reminder that people survive boarding house life for decades, that this isn't just a temporary hardship but a viable long-term existence. She's living proof that you can make a life here, however modest, however difficult. The passage has become your favourite place in the boarding house, more than your own room, more than the parlour. It's where you feel most connected to the community, most able to participate in the actual social fabric, rather than just performing adherence to rules. The passage is real in ways that the formal house spaces aren't. There's less pretending here, less maintaining of careful fictions, more acknowledgement of shared struggle and shared humanity. You've learned that the passage economy teaches you things about value that formal economics never could. An orange isn't worth a fixed price. It's worth what someone needs at the moment of trade. A drawing isn't valuable in money terms, but it's valuable in bringing beauty and recognition to someone's life. Tea isn't just tea, it's comfort and warmth, and a small luxury that makes endurance possible. Everything has multiple values: monetary, practical, social, emotional. The passage economy accounts for all of them. The passage is also teaching you about community in ways that textbooks about social theory never could. Community isn't something that exists naturally among people who happen to live near each other. It's something built deliberately through repeated small transactions, through tested trust, through shared resources and shared information and shared vulnerability. The passage is where community gets constructed, one trade at a time, one conversation at a time, one small act of generosity at a time. You understand now why Mrs. Hewitt allows the passage economy to flourish. It's not just about making rent collection easier, though that's certainly part of it. It's about creating conditions where human beings can survive with dignity, where poverty doesn't completely strip away agency and connection, where people can help each other in ways that preserve pride while providing actual material assistance. The passage economy is genius social engineering, possibly accidental but definitely effective. The back passage has become essential to your survival in the boarding house. You've traded your way into better supplies, better connections, better standing. You've learned what people value, what they need, how to help them in ways they can accept. You've become part of the informal network that underlies the formal house structure, the web of mutual support that makes life here bearable rather than merely endured. Tonight the passage is busy, several residents lingering in the mild evening air, conducting trades and having conversations that will never be acknowledged upstairs. Morrison is smoking his pipe and discussing coal prices with Fletcher. Miss Perry is showing Mrs. Cardwell some fabric she acquired and asking advice about whether it's worth mending or should be repurposed. The Lewins' child is playing some complicated game involving rocks and imagination, while adults pretend not to supervise him. You're arranging a trade with Wickham, some paper you don't need for some ink you do need. Both of you carefully making the exchange look like it benefits you equally, when actually you're both trying to give the other person the better deal. This is the black market of tenderness. This is where help gets disguised as commerce so pride stays intact. This is where community gets built through repeated small transactions that are simultaneously economic and emotional. This is where the boarding house shows its best self, where residents support each other in ways that the formal structure would never acknowledge but absolutely depends upon. The passage is proof that even in the most difficult circumstances, humans find ways to care for each other. Not always perfectly, not always fairly, but persistently, creating systems of mutual aid that operate outside and alongside formal economies, that value need over market price, that prioritize community survival over individual advantage. The back passage is where Victorian working-class solidarity becomes practical rather than theoretical, where political ideals about mutual support become daily practice. There's a door in the boarding house that most residents walk past dozens of times without consciously noticing it. It's tucked under the stairs, painted the same dingy colour as the walls, distinguished mainly by its complete lack of a handle. Not broken handle, not missing handle, no handle at all, just a small brass keyhole and some scratches where a handle used to be before someone deliberately removed it. This is the basement door, and its handleless state is entirely intentional. You become aware of the basement gradually, the way you become aware of background radiation or the fact that you're breathing. It's always been there, you just haven't thought about it. The house makes sounds that originate from below. Sometimes there's a smell of old damp that has to be coming from somewhere underground. Occasionally Mrs. Hewitt disappears through that door with her massive keyring and emerges 15 minutes later, carrying items that clearly weren't stored on any floor you have access to. The basement is where the boarding house stores things it doesn't want constantly visible. Extra furniture for rooms that are temporarily vacant. Cleaning supplies that can't be left where residents might use them freely. Broken items waiting to be repaired or disposed of. Luggage belonging to long-term residents who need storage space. And you gradually realise the accumulated detritus of lives that have passed through this house over decades. You learn about the basement properly when Mrs. Hewitt asks you to help move a bed frame down there. This is unusual. Mrs. Hewitt rarely asks residents for assistance with house maintenance, maintaining strict separation between her role as landlady and any suggestion that residents might be involved in actual building operations. But Morrison's occupied. Fletcher can't be trusted with important tasks after the bathroom incident, and apparently you've achieved sufficient status that Mrs. Hewitt believes you can carry furniture without catastrophe. She produces a key from her ring, inserts it into the basement door's brass keyhole, and opens it to reveal stairs descending into darkness that feels somehow thicker than normal darkness, like the air down there has been compressed by years of neglect and is now reluctant to move. Mrs. Hewitt lights a candle, hands you one end of the bed frame and starts down the stairs without apparent concern about the fact that you can barely see where you're stepping. The basement stairs are steep, narrow and protest every footstep with creaks that suggest they're considering early retirement. The walls are close, made of brick that weeps moisture in streaks of white mineral deposits that look disturbingly organic in the candlelight. The air temperature drops noticeably with each step and the smell intensifies. Damp, mould, old wood, earth, and something else that you can't quite identify, but that makes you think of things being slowly absorbed by time. The basement itself, when you reach it, is larger than you expected. It extends under most of the house's footprint, maybe 12 feet by 30 feet, with a ceiling so low that you have to duck in places where the floor joists sag. The floor is dirt, packed hard by years of foot traffic but still fundamentally earth, which explains the smell. The walls are brick, old brick, the kind that was laid when this building was constructed and that hasn't been pointed or repaired since roughly the Napoleonic Wars. The space is crowded with objects in various states of decay and usefulness. Furniture stacked haphazardly in corners, some pieces clearly broken, others just outdated or temporarily surplus. Trunks and cases with faded labels, names you don't recognize, addresses that might not exist anymore. Cleaning equipment hung on nails driven into the mortar between bricks. Piles of items that defy easy categorization, a broken clock, several mirrors, a collection of picture frames empty of pictures, a dressmaker's dummy missing one arm. But what strikes you most isn't the objects, it's the feeling. The basement has a presence, an atmosphere, a personality. This is where the house keeps secrets. Not scandalous secrets necessarily, just the accumulated privacy of people who've lived here and left traces of their existence that nobody knew what to do with. The basement is memory storage, the archive of boarding house history that's too mundane to preserve properly, but too personal to simply discard. Mrs. Hewitt directs you to place the bed frame against the far wall, stacking it with 3 other frames that are apparently the house's furniture reserve. As you work, you notice other things. A shelf of books, spines cracked and pages water-damaged, abandoned by residents who couldn't carry them when they left. A hat box that probably contains a hat that was too nice to throw away but too damaged or outdated to wear. A children's toy, a small wooden horse with a broken wheel completely out of place in a boarding house with a strict no-children policy. "Don't touch things that aren't your concern, Mrs. Hewitt says, which is the first time she's spoken since you entered the basement. Her voice sounds different down here, more careful, like even she respects whatever authority this space has over the house's hidden history. The basement keeps what the house needs to keep. Best to let it do its work. This is the most mystical thing you've ever heard, Mrs. Hewitt say, and you're not entirely sure what it means. Let the basement do its work? The basement is a storage space. It doesn't do work. Except you're starting to understand that maybe it does, in a way. The basement is where the house digests experience, where the material traces of past lives get absorbed into the building's foundation, where the boarding house processes its own history. You help Mrs. Hewitt with a few more items, moving things around according to her directions, creating space for new storage needs, apparently rearranging things according to some organizational system that makes sense to her, but that you can't decode. The longer you're down here, the more you notice. A small mirror with M. Patterson 1873 scratched into the wooden frame. A bundle of letters tied with string, too personal to read but too personal to burn. A woman's shoe, just one, decorated with embroidery that suggests it was someone's best shoe, their special occasion shoe, their last link to better circumstances. These objects tell stories that nobody's around to tell anymore. The mirror belonged to someone, maybe a relative of Mr. Patterson upstairs, maybe a previous resident with the same surname, maybe a complete stranger whose name happened to match. The letters represent conversations that mattered once, feelings that were important enough to preserve in writing, now reduced to bundled paper that nobody will ever read. The shoe was part of an outfit that made someone feel beautiful or confident or appropriate for whatever occasion required special shoes, and now it's alone in a basement, separated from its pair, its purpose completed, its owner gone to destinations unknown. Some residents leave things behind, Mrs. Hewitt says, apparently noticing your attention to the objects. Can't take everything when you go. Can't throw away everything that meant something. So it stays here until it doesn't mean anything anymore, and then eventually it gets cleared out. You realize that the basement is the boarding house's grieving process. It's where objects go when their owners leave, when their immediate utility is gone but their sentimental attachment lingers. The basement holds these items in a kind of purgatory, not quite discarded but not quite kept, waiting for enough time to pass that their emotional weight dissolves and they can be disposed of without guilt. This also means the basement contains the traces of every departed resident who left anything behind, which, given that this boarding house has been operating for at least 50 years based on the dates you can see scratched into things, is a lot of people. Hundreds of lives have passed through this building, stayed for weeks or months or years, and left behind fragments of themselves that accumulated down here like sediment in a river. The basement is archaeological, layers of history compressed into dim storage. Mrs. Hewitt is carefully not telling you this directly, but you're understanding it anyway. The basement is why the door has no handle. It's not supposed to be easily accessible. It's not for casual browsing or curious exploration. It's for specific purposes: storage of house necessities, depositing of items that need to be put away, retrieval of things when they're needed again. But mostly it's for keeping the past safely underground where it can't interfere with the present's ongoing attempt to survive. You'll come down here again, Mrs. Hewitt says as you finish moving things. Residents do eventually if they stay long enough. Something needs fetching, or storing, or checking on. But you don't come down here casually. You don't explore. You don't disturb things that aren't your business. The basement has its order, and maintaining that order is part of maintaining the house. This is as close to a philosophical statement about house management as you've ever heard from Mrs. Hewitt, and you're starting to understand that the basement is more important to her than any other part of the building. This is where she keeps the boarding house's memory, its history, its accumulated weight of experience. The rooms upstairs can be rented to new people, furniture can be replaced, residents come and go, but the basement stays constant, slowly accumulating evidence that people lived here, struggled here, mattered here, even if only briefly. As you climb back up the steep stairs, Mrs. Hewitt behind you with her candle casting dramatic shadows, you're thinking about what the basement represents. Every boarding house probably has a version of this, a space where the transient nature of residence collides with the permanence of the building itself. Residents are temporary. The house is permanent. The basement is where temporary leaves traces on permanent, where individual lives write themselves into institutional memory. Mrs. Hewitt locks the door behind you, the key turning with a solid click that sounds final, definitive. The basement is sealed again, back to its work of storage and digestion and gradual processing of the past into something that can eventually be forgotten. You're left in the hallway with dust on your clothes and the smell of basement damp in your nose and a new understanding of how the boarding house works. The basement explains some things that were mysterious before. Why, Mrs. Hewitt sometimes produces objects that perfectly suit a resident's need, like she's been storing them for exactly this moment. Why certain items disappear from the house without explanation, presumably having been judged ready for basement storage. Why there's a sense of continuity to the boarding house despite constant resident turnover. The basement is the constant, the archive, the institutional memory that persists through all changes in human occupancy. You start noticing when Mrs. Hewitt goes to the basement. It's not daily, more like weekly, brief visits that seem to serve no obvious purpose beyond checking on things. You realise she's maintaining the archive, making sure the storage is organised, deciding what can finally be discarded and what needs to be kept longer. She's the house's librarian, the keeper of its accumulated experience, the person who decides what gets remembered and what gets forgotten. Other residents are clearly aware of the basement, but nobody talks about it directly. Morrison mentions once that he helped move something down there years ago, speaking of it like it was a significant experience, almost ceremonial. Miss Perry refers to it obliquely when discussing a resident who left, saying something about how their things found their place, which is apparently code for their belongings are now in the basement waiting to be processed by time. The basement becomes part of how you understand the boarding house. This isn't just a building where people temporarily live. It's an organism with memory, with storage capacity for experience, with processes for dealing with loss and departure, and the constant churn of lives passing through. The basement is the house's subconscious, where things go when they can't be consciously dealt with but can't be entirely forgotten either. You think about what of yours might end up in the basement eventually. When you leave, if you leave, what will you be unable to take? What will be too heavy, too bulky, too impractical for wherever you go next? What will you abandon to the house's care, trusting that it'll be kept or discarded according to whatever timeline the basement operates on? The thought is both unsettling and oddly comforting. Something of you will remain here, even after you're gone. Some fragment of your time in this slanted room with its crying window will persist in the basement's archives. The basement also affects how you think about the other residents. Everyone here is temporary, you know this. People come and go constantly. But everyone's also leaving traces, creating history, becoming part of the house's memory whether they intend to or not. Mr. Wickham's self-conversations are being absorbed into the building's foundation through the medium of sound waves travelling through wood and plaster. Miss Perry's kindness is being recorded in the form of favours traded and help given. Morrison's reliability is becoming part of the house's institutional knowledge. The Lewins' secret child is writing himself into the building's unofficial history, existing in the gap between rules and reality. You're doing the same thing, creating a record of your residence that's being stored in multiple forms. The formal record in Mrs. Hewitt's ledger, the social record in other residents' memories and opinions, the physical record in wear patterns on your room's floor, scratches on your door, the specific way your window cry sounds versus other windows, and eventually probably some physical object that you'll leave behind when you go that will end up in the basement, that will sit in the dark for years being slowly forgotten until Mrs. Hewitt finally decides it's been long enough and throws it away. The basement is teaching you about impermanence and memory, about how institutions persist while individuals pass through, about how buildings absorb and store human experience even when humans themselves move on. It's a melancholy lesson, but not a depressing one. There's something comforting about knowing that your time here matters enough to be recorded, even if that record is just a scratched mirror or a forgotten letter, or a shoe without its pair sitting in darkness under the house's foundation. Mrs. Hewitt asks you to help with basement tasks occasionally after that first trip, retrieving items or storing things or moving furniture around. Each time you go down there, you notice different things. A stack of newspapers from decades ago, saved for some reason, now brittle and brown. A collection of bottles that must have contained something once but are now just empty glass with faded labels. A set of dishes that don't match any dishes currently in use upstairs, suggesting they belong to a different era of the house's operation. A photograph in a broken frame, faces you don't recognize, people who lived here or visited here or mattered here once and are now reduced to anonymous images in a basement. You start to understand that helping with basement tasks is actually a privilege, a sign of trust. Mrs. Hewitt doesn't ask everyone. She asks Morrison occasionally, being the senior resident and reliable. She asked you after you'd proven yourself through several months of acceptable behaviour. Fletcher notably has never been asked and probably never will be. The basement is for people who understand the importance of discretion, who won't gossip about what they see, who respect the house's need for private storage of its collective past. The basement has rules, unspoken like everything else in this building, but absolutely enforced. Don't touch items that aren't related to your specific task. Don't read letters or papers that clearly belong to departed residents. Don't ask questions about whose belongings are whose. Don't tell other residents what you see down there. But sometimes the basement shares information voluntarily, offering up objects that seem to have been waiting for specific moments. When Miss Perry needed a particular size needle for a complex mending project, Mrs. Hewitt went to the basement and came back with a complete sewing kit that had apparently been stored there for years. When Morrison needed a specific type of lamp for his room, the basement provided one, dusty but functional. When you mentioned you wished you had a small mirror, Mrs. Hewitt appeared the next day with one that came from basement storage, the name scratched into its frame, polished away but still faintly visible. These aren't coincidences, you realise. Mrs. Hewitt is actively managing the basement as a resource, keeping track of what's stored there, matching current needs with past abandonments. The basement is functioning as the house's long-term storage and its emergency supply cache, providing for current residents through the preserved possessions of previous residents. It's a kind of intergenerational mutual aid, people who lived here years ago unknowingly helping people who live here now through the objects they left behind. The basement is also where broken things go to be evaluated. Not everything that breaks gets thrown away immediately. Items get stored in the basement for a period of time during which Mrs. Hewitt apparently considers whether they're worth repairing, whether they might be useful for parts, whether they could serve some future need. This creates a grace period between broken and discarded, allowing for second chances and reconsideration. You've noticed that the basement's population changes slowly. Items that were there on your first visit are gone by your third visit. New items appear. Some things move from one section to another, apparently being reclassified or reassessed. The basement isn't static storage, it's active processing. The house's digestive system slowly working through its accumulated possessions, deciding what to absorb, what to preserve, what to finally release. There's something almost sacred about the basement, despite its mundane contents and practical purpose. It's the only space in the boarding house that's consistently private, that residents can't casually access, that maintains boundaries against the constant intrusion that characterizes every other part of the building. The basement's privacy is absolute, protected by a locked door without a handle, controlled entirely by Mrs. Hewitt and her authority. This makes the basement symbolically important beyond its physical function. It represents the idea that privacy is possible, that some things can be kept separate, that not everything has to be shared or known or available. In a building where walls broadcast your every sound and neighbours know your habits better than you do, where communal resources require constant negotiation and personal space is measured in inches, the basement's absolute privacy is proof that boundaries can exist if they're important enough to enforce. You think about this sometimes when lying in your slanted room, listening to your neighbours through the walls, aware that they're listening to you right back. The basement is underneath all of you, silent and sealed, storing things that nobody talks about, keeping secrets that nobody's trying to discover. It's a comfort somehow, knowing that underneath the constant exposure of boarding house life, there's a space where things can be truly hidden, truly private, truly safe from observation. The basement is teaching you that some things should stay buried, not because they're shameful, but because they're complete. The past is past. The departed have departed. The objects they left behind are transitioning from personal possessions to impersonal storage to eventual disposal, and that transition requires time and darkness, and the kind of patient forgetting that only basements can provide. Rushing this process, exposing it to light and inquiry, would be disrespectful to both the objects and their previous owners. Mrs. Hewitt, you realise, is protecting the dignity of departed residents by giving their abandoned possessions this dignified transition period. She's not immediately throwing away someone's personal items the moment they leave. She's storing them, waiting, allowing time to pass, until eventually the items lose their association with specific people and become just objects again, free to be disposed of or repurposed without emotional weight. This is kindness, though Mrs. Hewitt would never describe it that way. The basement is the house's heart, you decide. Not the warm beating heart of life and energy, but the steady, persistent heart of memory and continuity. It pumps slowly, processing experience, storing what needs storing, releasing what can be released. It's always there, always working, never stopping, keeping the house alive as an institution, even while individual residents come and go like blood cells being constantly replaced while the organism persists. You've been asked to help with the basement enough times now that you're becoming familiar with its geography and contents. You know where the spare furniture is stacked. You know which section contains cleaning supplies. You know that the far corner, the dampest part that stays in shadow even when candles are lit, is where the most personal items are stored, the things that belong to specific people and that are waiting longest for enough time to pass that they can be forgotten. You don't go to that corner without specific instruction from Mrs. Hewitt. Those items aren't for browsing or curiosity. They're in transition, in purgatory, and disturbing them would be disturbing someone's incomplete departure. The basement demands respect, and part of that respect is maintaining boundaries even within its already bounded space. Tonight, after another basement trip to store some extra blankets for winter, you're back in your slanted room thinking about what you learned down there. The basement isn't just storage. It's the house's memory, its archive, its grieving process, its digestive system, its heart. It's where the boarding house processes the constant churn of lives, where it stores what needs storing and releases what can be released, where it maintains continuity despite constant change. The basement is also where you might end up, in a sense. When you eventually leave this place, whenever that happens, something of yours will probably stay behind. A book you can't fit in your luggage. A piece of clothing too worn to take but too associated with memories to just throw away. Some small object that defined your time here but won't make sense wherever you go next. It'll go to the basement, where it'll sit in the dark with all the other fragments of previous lives, slowly losing its connection to you, slowly becoming just another anonymous object, until finally Mrs. Hewitt decides enough time has passed and disposes of it. This should be sad, but somehow it's not. It's how things work. It's how the house maintains itself while residents pass through. It's how individual temporariness gets absorbed into institutional permanence. The basement is proof that you were here, even after you're gone. That you mattered enough to the house to have your traces stored, processed, eventually forgotten. That's not nothing. That's actually something quite significant in its way. The door without a handle keeps its secrets. The basement does its work. The house continues, processing lives, storing memories, maintaining continuity. And you're part of it now. Another layer in the sediment, another name that might someday be scratched into a mirror frame, another fragment of experience being absorbed into the boarding house's long, patient memory. You've been living in the boarding house for 3 months when the toilet decides to stage a dramatic protest against its working conditions. It's a Tuesday morning, approximately 7:15, which is peak bathroom usage time when half the house is trying to get ready for work simultaneously. The timing could not be worse, which is probably why the toilet chose this exact moment to catastrophically fail in ways that suggest it's been planning this rebellion for weeks. The first sign of trouble is a sound that doesn't belong in any plumbing system designed by rational humans. A gurgle, but not a normal gurgle. This is a gurgle with ambition, with malice, with plans for your immediate future that definitely don't involve you getting to work on time. The gurgle is followed by a suspicious silence, which is worse than the gurgle because silence in plumbing means something's either completely broken or actively plotting. Then comes the overflow. Not a trickle, not a minor inconvenience. A full theatrical production of water emerging from places water should absolutely not emerge from, spreading across the bathroom floor with the determination of something that's been held back too long and is now seizing its freedom. Someone screams. Multiple people scream. Doors slam. Footsteps thunder on the stairs in both directions as some residents flee the scene, while others run toward it to witness the disaster firsthand. You're in your room when you hear the commotion, and your first instinct is to stay there. This is not your problem. You didn't break the toilet. You weren't even using the bathroom. Your wisest course of action is to remain in your slanted room, pretend ignorance of the entire situation, and hope it resolves itself before you need to use the facilities. This is the coward's strategy, and it's looking pretty appealing until you hear Mrs. Hewitt's voice cutting through the chaos like a knife through particularly stubborn butter. Everyone downstairs. Kitchen. Now, this is not a request. This is a mobilization order. Mrs. Hewitt, you abandon your plan of strategic uninvolvement and head downstairs with everyone else, joining the crowd assembling in the kitchen with various states of mourning preparedness. Morrison is fully dressed. Miss Perry is wearing a dressing gown over her work clothes. Fletcher is definitely not awake yet, but is present anyway. The Lewins arrive together, their not living here child mysteriously absent, probably hidden in their room for the duration of the crisis. Mrs. Hewitt stands at the kitchen table with the commanding presence of a general addressing troops before battle. Her expression is grim but not panicked, suggesting this isn't the first toilet rebellion she's managed and won't be the last. Behind her is an array of supplies, buckets, rags, a bottle of vinegar the size of a small child, something that might be sawdust or might be sand, and various other implements that look vaguely medieval. The privy has failed, Mrs. Hewitt announces, using the old-fashioned term for toilet in a way that somehow makes the situation sound both more dignified and more dire. The overflow has been contained to the bathroom, but the floor is compromised and the mechanism will require professional repair that cannot happen until this afternoon at the earliest. We have approximately 8 hours to manage this situation without the facility functioning. This is not ideal. 13 people sharing one toilet when the toilet is working is challenging enough. 13 people sharing 0 toilets is the kind of problem that could spark actual riots. You can see the panic calculation happening on everyone's faces. How long can I hold it? Do I dare visit a public facility? Is there anywhere nearby I could possibly go? How do people live without modern plumbing? And why did I drink so much tea yesterday? However, Mrs. Hewitt continues, before the professional repair, we must address the immediate aftermath. The bathroom requires cleaning, the overflow must be sanitized, and the surrounding area needs protection from additional water damage. This is a house emergency, which means all residents participate in resolution. No exceptions. This is the moment when you realize you're about to become intimately familiar with the least pleasant aspects of communal living. You're going to clean up toilet overflow with your neighbors. You're going to do it together. You're going to bond over this experience in ways that will permanently alter your relationship with everyone present. This is either going to bring the house together or tear it apart, and Mrs. Hewitt is betting on the former. She assigns roles with the efficiency of someone who's done disaster management so many times it's become routine. Morrison, as senior resident, gets the responsibility of assessing the actual plumbing damage and determining what can be temporarily patched versus what requires professional intervention. Miss Perry and Mrs. Cardwell, as the residents with the most domestic expertise, are in charge of the actual cleaning operation. Fletcher and the Lewins are on water duty, hauling clean water up from the kitchen pump and contaminated water down to be disposed of outside. The younger residents, including you, are assigned to the sanitation brigade, which is exactly as pleasant as it sounds. Mrs. Hewitt herself will be coordinating operations, managing the professional repair booking, and making sure nobody dies of embarrassment or actual sanitation issues during the process. She produces the massive bottle of vinegar and begins explaining its use in the kind of detail that suggests she's had this speech prepared for exactly this emergency. Vinegar, apparently, is Victorian England's answer to everything from cleaning to disinfection to possibly spiritual purification. You're going to be using a lot of vinegar today. The cleaning operation begins with everyone gathering supplies and ascending to the bathroom with the solemn determination of soldiers going to war. The bathroom door opens to reveal the full extent of the disaster, and it's worse than you imagined. The floor is completely flooded, water standing maybe 2 inches deep and of a colour that you're going to try very hard not to think about. The toilet itself looks innocent, like it had nothing to do with this disaster, like the water just spontaneously decided to appear from nowhere. Right then, Miss Perry says, rolling up her sleeves with the air of someone confronting an unpleasant but necessary task. Buckets first. We get the standing water out, then we can address the sanitizing. What follows is perhaps the least glamorous activity you've ever participated in. Armed with buckets and working in relay, you and the other residents begin the slow process of transferring contaminated water from the bathroom floor to buckets to the back passage where it can be poured onto the paving stones and allowed to drain away naturally. This is not fast. This is not pleasant. This is Victorian plumbing disaster management in its rawest form, all manual labour and determined grimness. But something interesting starts happening about 30 minutes into the operation. People start talking. Not about the disaster, that would be too direct, too acknowledging of the unpleasantness. But about other things. Mundane things. Fletcher mentioned something about his work. Morrison shares an observation about the weather. Miss Perry hums while she scrubs, transforming the horror into something vaguely musical. The conversation flows around and through the work, making it bearable, making it almost normal. You're working next to Wickham, who you've barely spoken to beyond morning nods, and he's explaining something about mathematical ratios in a way that's clearly helping him cope with the fact that he's currently mopping up toilet water. You find yourself actually interested in what he's saying, partly because it's genuinely interesting and partly because focusing on mathematics is preferable to focusing on current circumstances. The key is proportional response, Wickham is saying while wringing out a rag with impressive efficiency. Too much vinegar and you're wasting resources. Too little and you're not achieving sanitization. The ratio needs to account for surface area, contamination severity, and available supply. It's actually quite elegant if you think about it mathematically. This is perhaps the most human Wickham has been since you moved in, and you realise the crisis has stripped away everyone's careful social performance. There's no point maintaining dignity when you're all literally cleaning up the same disaster. The normal social hierarchies are suspended. Mrs. Young is working alongside Fletcher without apparent concern for rank. Mrs. Cardwell and Perry are collaborating as equals despite their different ages and circumstances. Even Mrs. Hewitt has removed her landlady persona temporarily, becoming just another person fighting the good fight against plumbing failure. The vinegar, when it's deployed in quantity across the bathroom floor, creates a smell that's somehow both terrible and purifying. It burns your nose and makes your eyes water, but it also creates the sensation that things are being genuinely cleaned, that the disaster is being pushed back through sheer chemical force. Miss Perry adds some kind of herbs to the vinegar mixture, explaining that it helps with the smell and has antiseptic properties. You don't ask what herbs or how she knows this. You're just grateful that the overwhelming reek of vinegar is slightly modified by something vaguely plant-like. Someone, possibly Morrison, starts humming a work song. Not a specific song, just a rhythm that helps coordinate the scrubbing efforts. Other people pick it up, creating an unconscious harmony that turns the cleaning operation into something vaguely coordinated and almost pleasant. This is how humans cope with unpleasant collective tasks, apparently. They sing, or hum, or create rhythmic sounds that transform individual labour into group activity. 2 hours into the operation, the bathroom is starting to look less like a disaster zone and more like a room that's been aggressively cleaned. The standing water is gone. The surfaces have been scrubbed multiple times. The vinegar smell is overwhelming but reassuring. Morrison has performed some kind of temporary repair involving string and what appears to be a piece of leather, creating a seal that will hopefully hold until the professional can arrive. Mrs. Hewitt appears with tea, actual hot tea, which she distributes to everyone working like she's offering sacraments. The tea break happens in the hallway outside the bathroom because nobody wants to sit in there, and it's the first time you've seen all the residents together in an informal group outside of the parlour. Everyone's dishevelled, everyone's tired, everyone's probably questioning their life choices, but there's also something else. Camaraderie. Solidarity. The strange warmth that comes from shared suffering successfully endured together. Not exactly how anyone planned to spend their Tuesday, Morrison observes, which might be the understatement of the century, but which makes everyone laugh anyway. Could be worse, Miss Perry adds. Could have been Wednesday. This makes no logical sense, but everyone laughs again because logic doesn't matter right now. What matters is that the group survived something unpleasant together, and humour is how you mark that survival. Fletcher makes a joke about his previous bathroom flooding incident being practice for this moment, which is brave given that his reputation is still recovering. But people laugh at his joke too, and you can see him relax slightly, like maybe he's finally being forgiven for past mistakes through present competence. The professional plumber arrives around 3 in the afternoon, a gruff man who takes one look at the bathroom and makes a sound that suggests he's seen worse but not recently. He disappears into the small space with his tools, and the sounds that emerge over the next hour suggest he's performing surgery on the plumbing system with varying degrees of success. The residents hover nearby, having invested too much effort into the cleanup to not witness the actual repair. When the plumber finally emerges, he announces that the toilet is functional again, the overflow won't repeat as long as everyone's reasonable about usage, and the bill will be substantial, but not catastrophic. Mrs. Hewitt pays him from a cash box she retrieves from her private quarters, and there's a collective sigh of relief that ripples through the assembled residents. The crisis is over. The toilet works. Life can return to normal, or whatever passes for normal in a Victorian boarding house. But something has changed, and you notice it immediately in the days following the Great Toilet Rebellion of Tuesday. The social dynamics have shifted. People who barely spoke before are now exchanging casual greetings. The bathroom schedule, previously a source of tension, has become more flexible as everyone shares collective memory of what happens when the system fails completely. There's a new patience with minor inconveniences, a recognition that if the house survived the toilet disaster together, it can survive basically anything. You personally notice the change most clearly the next morning at breakfast. You're waiting in the usual queue for porridge when Mrs. Young, who would normally go ahead of you based on seniority, gestures for you to go first. It's a small thing, barely noticeable, but it's significant. You participated in the crisis response. You helped clean up the disaster. You're no longer just the new person in the slanted fourth-floor room. You're someone who showed up when the house needed help. Mrs. Hewitt acknowledges your upgraded status more subtly. She nods when you pass in the hallway, not the formal landlady nod she gives to tenants, but something closer to the nod she gives Morrison. Recognition between people who've been through something together. You haven't achieved Morrison's legendary status, obviously, but you've moved up from provisional resident to confirmed member of the house community. Miss Perry's acknowledgement is more direct. She leaves a small package outside your door wrapped in paper, containing 2 of her precious biscuits and a small note that says simply, "Thank you for Tuesday." This is huge. Perry's biscuits are social currency, and she's spending that currency on you, marking you as someone worth the investment. You eat the biscuits slowly, recognizing them as the edible equivalent of a commendation medal. Even Fletcher, still rebuilding his own reputation, treats you differently. He nods when you pass on the stairs, a gesture of solidarity between people who've both proven themselves through crisis response. His nod says, "We've been through something together," and "maybe we're going to be okay here after all." You nod back, accepting the solidarity, acknowledging the shared experience. The toilet disaster becomes part of house lore, a story that gets referenced in conversation but never fully told, because everyone who matters was there, and everyone who wasn't there doesn't need the details. Remember Tuesday becomes shorthand for remember when we all pulled together and survived something unpleasant. It's a bonding experience that's more effective than any planned team-building exercise could ever be. You understand now why Mrs. Hewitt called everyone to help rather than just hiring professionals from the start. She could have paid someone to handle the entire cleanup. She could have managed the crisis without resident involvement. But she chose instead to turn the disaster into a community event, forcing everyone to work together, breaking down social barriers through shared unpleasant labour. It was strategic, brilliant, and completely effective. The toilet has been baptised in vinegar and collective effort, and in the process, so has your membership in the boarding house community. You're no longer an outsider being evaluated. You're someone who showed up when things got difficult, who didn't complain excessively, who helped without being forced, who maintained humour during unpleasantness. These are the qualities that matter in shared housing, and you've demonstrated them under pressure. The house feels different after Tuesday, more cohesive, more like a community that's chosen each other rather than just tolerating proximity. The hallways have friendlier energy. The parlour conversations are warmer. Even the morning bathroom queue feels less contentious, everyone having been reminded of what actual bathroom disaster looks like, and having concluded that minor wait times are really not worth complaining about. Mrs. Hewitt's management genius is becoming clearer to you. She could run this boarding house as a purely transactional business, collect rent, provide minimal services, maintain order through strict rules. Instead, she's created a community, partially through her formal systems like the ledger and rent day, but also through strategic use of crises to force residents into cooperative behaviour. The toilet disaster wasn't just a plumbing failure, it was an opportunity for community building that she seized and managed expertly. It's a Thursday afternoon, which is odd because you're home, and Thursday afternoons are work time. Everyone should be at their various jobs earning the money that pays for their slanted rooms and dubious porridge. But you're home because you're ill, nothing serious, just a cold that made going to work seem inadvisable, and you're lying in your bed listening to the house in a way you've never been able to before. The house sounds completely different during the day when most residents are gone. The constant background noise of human occupation is missing, and what's left is just the house itself, the building's own sounds, the creaks and groans and subtle movements that usually get drowned out by footsteps and conversation, and Mr. Wickham self-debates. And the house is being weird. Not alarmingly weird. Not supernatural weird. Just actively weird. Things are happening that don't happen during normal occupied hours. Creaks that sound purposeful rather than random. The sense that someone's moving around even though you're fairly certain you're alone except maybe for Mrs. Hewitt, who's always here somewhere. Small sounds that seem to follow patterns, like the house is going through some kind of routine. You get out of bed, partially because you're curious, and partially because lying down all day is making you restless. You navigate your slanted room with practiced ease, avoiding the squeaky floorboard and the spot where your floor likes to catch your sock and pull it off your foot. The hallway outside is empty, dim, eerily quiet in the afternoon light that comes through windows you never usually see illuminated at this angle. The creaking is coming from downstairs, definite purposeful movement, not the random settling that happens constantly in Victorian buildings. You descend carefully, aware that you're technically supposed to be resting but unable to resist investigating the mystery of the daytime house sounds. What you find in the parlour is Mrs. Hewitt doing something you've never witnessed before. She's adjusting things. Not cleaning, not maintaining, but adjusting. She's moving the clock on the mantelpiece very slightly to the left. She's straightening a picture frame that wasn't noticeably crooked. She's running her hand along the back of the warm chair like she's checking its temperature, or maybe blessing it. She's performing what looks like a ritual, small precise movements that seem to have meaning beyond their practical effect. You must make a sound because Mrs. Hewitt looks up, not startled exactly but alert, like she's been caught doing something private. For a moment you're both frozen, you in the doorway trying to decide if you should apologise for interrupting, her at the mantelpiece with her hand still on the clock, clearly in the middle of whatever this is. You're meant to be resting, she says finally, which is not an accusation exactly, but definitely an observation that you're not where you should be. I heard the house creaking, you explain, which sounds absurd out loud but is the truth. Differently than usual. I was curious. Mrs. Hewitt considers this, her hand dropping from the clock and something in her expression shifts. A decision being made. The house needs attention, she says slowly, like she's trying to determine how much to explain. Regular attention beyond the cleaning and maintenance. Especially on quiet days. This is cryptic, but you're interested enough to push slightly. What kind of attention, Mrs. Hewitt looks at you for a long moment, presumably assessing whether you're trustworthy with whatever information she's considering sharing. Apparently the toilet disaster earned you enough credibility because she sighs and gestures toward the chair Morrison usually occupies. Sit, she says. If you're not going to rest properly, you might as well understand. You sit. Mrs. Hewitt remains standing, which maintains the power dynamic while allowing the conversation to happen. She's still your landlady, but she's also apparently about to share something that goes beyond typical landlady-tenant interactions. This house has been boarding house for 53 years, Mrs. Hewitt begins. Before that it was private residence, before that something else. Buildings this old develop personalities. Not supernatural, I'm not talking about ghosts or spirits. But patterns. Memory in the structure itself. Ways things prefer to be. You're not entirely sure where this is going, but you're absolutely listening. The house settles, Mrs. Hewitt continues. Not just physically, though certainly there's that. It settles emotionally, if buildings can be said to have emotions. It absorbs the people who live here, their habits, their sounds, their presence. And when everyone's gone during the day, it gets unsettled. Anxious, if you will. The sudden quiet after the morning chaos creates stress in the structure. This is the most mystical thing you've ever heard, Mrs. Hewitt say, and you're trying to determine if she's being metaphorical or if she literally believes the building has feelings. Her expression suggests she's not entirely sure herself, but that she's committed to the concept regardless of its metaphysical accuracy. So on days like today, she continues, when the house is mostly empty, when it's quiet enough to hear the structure itself, I give it attention. Small adjustments that help it resettle. Straightening things, checking things, making sure everything's in its proper place. The house appreciates order, and providing that order helps it. Calm down. You're fascinated and slightly bewildered. You're saying the house needs to be soothed? I'm saying the house functions better when treated as a participant rather than just a container, Mrs. Hewitt corrects. Call it superstition if you like. Call it building maintenance psychology. Call it whatever makes sense to you. But I've been managing boarding houses for 30 years, and I've learned that buildings respond to care, and care includes attention to their less tangible needs. She returns to the mantelpiece, makes another small adjustment to the clock, and you notice for the first time that the clock isn't running. It's stopped at exactly 3:42 and has been stopped at 3:42 for as long as you've lived here. You just never thought about it before. The clock stays stopped, Mrs. Hewitt says, noticing your attention. It stopped at 3:42 15 years ago, the day my husband died. Could wind it again, obviously, but the house seems to prefer it stopped. Gives time a rest, as it were. Everything in boarding house is temporary. Everyone's always rushing, always watching the clock for work or meals or rent day. This clock says time can stop sometimes, that moments can be held. The house likes that message. This is unexpectedly profound, and you're not quite sure how to respond. Mrs. Hewitt saves you from having to figure it out by moving to the picture frames on the wall, which she straightens one by one even though none of them appear tilted. The pictures want to lean, she says conversationally, like this is a normal thing pictures want to do. Foundation's settling, walls aren't quite vertical, frames naturally tilt. But straightening them regularly reminds the house that we care about maintaining standards despite the physical challenges. It's communication between residents and structure. You watch as she continues her circuit of the room, touching things lightly, adjusting minimally, creating the impression of ritual more than practical maintenance. She's communing with the building, you realise, having a conversation with the structure itself through these small physical adjustments. Would you like to help? Mrs. Hewitt asks suddenly, which is unexpected but also somehow inevitable given that you've witnessed this private ritual. I'm not sure what to do, you admit. Neither am I entirely, Mrs. Hewitt responds with surprising honesty. It's not about doing specific things correctly. It's about paying attention to the house, noticing what seems out of place, addressing small issues before they become large ones. Here, try this. She leads you to a bookshelf in the corner where a few books are shelved haphazardly, spines not quite aligned, some leaning against others. Straighten these, she instructs. Not just visually straight, but so they feel balanced. The house carries weight, literally and figuratively. Books represent knowledge, memory, past residents who left them behind. Treating them properly acknowledges that history. You approach the bookshelf with new reverence, understanding that this is about more than books being tidy. You're being taught how to care for the house in ways that go beyond sweeping floors and paying rent. You start straightening, paying attention to how each book feels in your hand, how it sits against its neighbours, whether the arrangement feels balanced or stressed. That's right, Mrs. Hewitt says approvingly as you work. You're feeling it. The house appreciates attention to detail, recognition that its components matter individually as well as collectively. You move from the bookshelf to other small adjustments, Mrs. Hewitt suggests, adjusting a cushion on the warm chair so it sits just right, making sure the fire poker is perfectly vertical in its stand, checking that the curtains hang evenly. Each small task feels ridiculous and profound simultaneously, like you're participating in a ceremony whose meaning you don't fully understand but that clearly matters. The house creaks differently after this attention, Mrs. Hewitt explains as you work. Listen tomorrow morning during the usual chaos. The sounds will be slightly different, slightly calmer. The structure responds to care even if we can't scientifically explain how or why. An hour passes in this strange communion with the building. Mrs. Hewitt teaches you which floorboards prefer to be stepped on versus avoided, which doors like to be opened slowly versus quickly, which windows need specific handling because their frames are more temperamental than others. It's a masterclass in building psychology, or maybe building anthropomorphization, or maybe just careful observation codified into ritual. At some point Morrison appears, apparently also home early for some reason, and he joins the activity without needing explanation. He obviously knows about this ritual, possibly participates regularly, and he moves through the house making his own small adjustments with the confidence of someone who's done this many times. He straightens the newspapers he keeps stacked by his chair, arranges the coal scuttle handles all facing the same direction, adjusts the window latch in the parlour so it sits more comfortably in its frame. The house is easier when people understand it has preferences, Morrison says to you while adjusting the latch. Not requirements, preferences. Things work better when we accommodate rather than fight. Miss Perry arrives next, also mysteriously home during work hours, and she too joins without question. She brings special attention to the kitchen, adjusting pots and pans so they hang more comfortably, organising the tea supplies with what seems like ritual precision, polishing the surfaces that get touched most often. Her movements are almost meditative, like she's praying through physical action. I do this every Thursday, Perry mentions while polishing the kettle. My afternoon off. The house is quieter then, more receptive to attention. Mrs. Hewitt taught me years ago when I first moved in. You're starting to understand that this isn't Mrs. Hewitt's private ritual, but rather a house tradition that senior residents know about and participate in. The Thursday afternoon house settling, when people who can make time do so, giving attention to the building that shelters them all, maintaining relationship with the structure through small, careful actions. Mrs. Cardwell emerges from her room where she's apparently been this whole time, and she contributes her own form of attention. She sits in the parlour and does needlework, but periodically she looks around the room and comments on things. The curtain on the left wants mending, she observes. The floorboard by the door is feeling neglected. These aren't criticisms, they're diagnoses, like she's a building doctor making rounds. Mrs. Hewitt produces a small notebook and records Mrs. Cardwell's observations. The house tells her things, Mrs. Hewitt explains to you. She's been here long enough to recognise when something's developing a problem before it becomes obvious. We maintain her observations so we can address issues early. The afternoon progresses in this strange suspended state. The house is receiving attention from multiple residents simultaneously, everyone making small adjustments and improvements, creating a collective act of building care that's somewhere between maintenance and worship. The house seems to respond, or maybe you're just becoming more attuned to its normal sounds, but the creaking does seem more contented, more settled, less anxious. Around 4 o'clock, Mrs. Hewitt makes tea for everyone participating in the ritual. You all sit in the parlour, drinking tea and discussing the house like it's a mutual friend who needs looking after. Morrison mentions that the banister on the second floor feels loose. Perry notes that the kitchen pump is making new sounds. Mrs. Cardwell observes that the parlour fire has been drawing better lately, probably appreciates the attention to the flue. You tentatively mention that your room's window seems slightly less weepy, though you're not sure if that's real or imagination. The window responds to recognition, Mrs. Hewitt says seriously. You've stopped fighting it, accepted its crying as natural feature rather than problem to solve. The window appreciates that acceptance and moderates its behaviour accordingly. This is completely insane and also somehow makes perfect sense within the internal logic of boarding house life. The building is a participant in the community, not just a passive structure. It has preferences and responds to treatment. Caring for it properly means acknowledging its personality and working with it rather than against it. After tea, Mrs. Hewitt produces a small box from somewhere in her private quarters. Inside are various small objects: thimbles, buttons, coins, small pieces of broken pottery or glass that have been polished smooth. Offerings, she explains. When the house gives something to a resident, we acknowledge it. When a resident wants to acknowledge the house, they leave something small. Nothing valuable, just tokens of recognition. She demonstrates by taking a polished thimble and placing it on the mantelpiece next to the stopped clock. For the house, she says simply. Thanks for maintaining our shelter, Morrison adds a small coin. Perry places a button. Mrs. Cardwell contributes a small piece of embroidered fabric. They're making offerings to the building like it's a household god, which in a way it is. The house is the thing that keeps them from being homeless, that provides shelter and community and continuity. Showing gratitude through small symbolic offerings makes sense in that context, however pagan it might seem. Your turn, Mrs. Hewitt says, offering you the box. You look through the collection of small objects, trying to decide what feels appropriate. You settle on a small, smooth stone, nothing special but something you've been carrying in your pocket since you moved in, a remnant from home that's become a habit more than a meaningful object. You place it next to the other offerings, adding your contribution to the collection of tokens acknowledging the house's role in residents' lives. Good, Mrs. Hewitt says approvingly. The house acknowledges your acknowledgement. As evening approaches and it's time for residents to start returning from work, those who participated in the afternoon ritual disperse back to their rooms. But before you leave, Mrs. Hewitt stops you. You're one of us now, she says quietly. Really one of us, not just living here but belonging here. The house accepts you. Thursday afternoons, if you're available, you're welcome to participate in the settling ritual. Not required, but welcome. She produces something from her pocket, a small thimble that's been polished until it gleams. The house wanted you to have this, she says, placing it in your hand. It's been sitting in the basement for years, waiting for the right person. I think you're the right person. You look at the thimble, which has some kind of engraving on it too worn to read clearly. It's beautiful in an understated way, clearly old, clearly valuable, at least in sentimental terms. You're holding a piece of house history, a gift from the building itself as mediated by Mrs. Hewitt, and you're absurdly touched. Thank you, you say to Mrs. Hewitt and to the house in general. Thank the house by staying, Mrs. Hewitt responds. By paying attention to it. By participating in its care. Buildings outlive people, but they need people to maintain them. You're part of that maintenance now. You return to your slanted room holding your thimble, this token of belonging, this evidence that you're not just renting space but participating in something larger. The house feels different around you, more welcoming, more consciously sheltering. Or maybe you just feel different about the house, more connected, more responsible, more grateful. That night, lying in your bed with your thimble on the table where you can see it, you listen to the house settling for the evening. The familiar sounds of residents returning, of evening routines beginning, of the building absorbing another day of life. But underneath those human sounds, you can hear the house itself, the structure creaking and shifting and adjusting, and it does sound calmer somehow, more content, like it appreciates the attention it received today. The stopped clock on the mantelpiece stays stopped at 3:42, holding that moment forever, reminding everyone that time can pause sometimes. The offerings accumulate on the mantel, small tokens of gratitude from residents who understand that the house is more than just walls and floors. The pictures hang slightly crooked because the foundation is settling, but they get straightened regularly because residents care about maintaining standards despite physical challenges. The house creaks during the day because it's settling, because it's adjusting, because it's alive in ways that go beyond normal building function. And now you know how to respond to that creaking, how to provide attention and care and small ritual adjustments that help the house feel valued. You're a building caretaker now, not just a resident. You belong to the house as much as it belongs to you. Your thimble sits on your table, catching morning light through your crying window, a small piece of polished metal that represents acceptance, belonging, responsibility. The house wanted you to have it. The house chose you. The house knows you're one of the good ones now, someone who shows up for toilet disasters, someone who participates in settling rituals, someone who understands that buildings need care beyond mere maintenance. Welcome to the inner circle of boarding house life. Mind the house's preferences. Straighten things regularly. Leave small offerings when moved to do so. Listen to Mrs. Cardwell's building diagnosis. Participate in Thursday settling when you can. And remember that the clock stays stopped at 3:42 because sometimes time needs to rest. And houses that have seen 53 years of boarding house chaos deserve moments of stillness acknowledged and preserved. The house creaks. You listen. You understand. You belong. You wake up one morning and Miss Perry's gone. Not gone in the dramatic sense with police involvement and worried neighbours. Just gone in the boarding house sense, which is somehow more final despite being completely mundane. Her room is empty. Her things have vanished. The space she occupied in the house's daily rhythm has collapsed in on itself like the room was never inhabited at all. There was no announcement. No farewell party. No tearful goodbye scene in the parlour. Yesterday evening she was humming in the back passage while hanging laundry, and this morning there's a sign hanging on the front door. Room to let weekly, inquire within. That's it. That's the entire memorial to Miss Perry's 1.5 years in residence. A sign on a nail that's probably been used for the same purpose dozens of times before. The absence is specific and shaped exactly like Perry. The morning bathroom queue moves differently without her cheerful humming. The kitchen feels less warm without her pocket supply of food supplements appearing during breakfast. The back passage economy loses one of its most active traders. The house adjusts to her absence with the efficiency of an organism that's used to cells being replaced. But for the first few days you can feel the Perry-shaped silence in specific places. Nobody discusses it directly, because that would violate the unspoken rule about departures being natural events that require no explanation. But Morrison mentions over breakfast that the shop where Perry worked was bought out by new owners who didn't retain staff. Mrs. Cardwell observes that Perry had family in the north who'd been asking her to come home. These fragments float through conversation like debris from a shipwreck, allowing people to construct their own understanding of why Perry left, without anyone having to directly say, Miss Perry is gone, and we miss her. You understand now why departures happen without theatre. Victorian working-class life is precarious enough without adding emotional weight to every transition. People leave boarding houses constantly, for jobs, for family, for cheaper rent, for better circumstances, for worse circumstances, or simply because they've had enough of London and whatever drew them here has stopped being sufficient reason to stay. Making a big production of every departure would be exhausting, and would highlight the constant instability that everyone's trying not to think about too hard. But Perry's absence still hurts in small ways. You keep expecting to see her in her usual spots. Your brain hasn't updated its model of the house to exclude her yet, so you experience these brief moments of surprise when you see her chair empty or realise she won't be participating in the evening parlour gathering. The house is teaching you about impermanence in the most practical way possible, by removing people you've gotten used to and forcing you to adapt to their absence. The new tenant arrives within a week because empty rooms don't earn rent, and Mrs. Hewitt's business model depends on maximum occupancy. Her name is Miss Thompson. She's younger than Perry. She works at a different shop doing similar work, and she's nervous in the way all new residents are nervous when they realise they're joining an established community with invisible rules and complex social dynamics. You watch Thompson navigate her first days with the recognition of someone who's been through exactly this recently. She makes the same mistakes you made, using the kitchen kettle without refilling it, sitting too close to Mrs. Young's chair in the parlour, being too loud in the hallways after 10. The house corrects her through the usual methods of coordinated social pressure and significant silences. She learns, or she'll leave and be replaced by someone else who'll learn. This is how the boarding house maintains its culture across constantly changing population. But here's the weird thing, sometimes people come back. Not often, but occasionally. You're helping Mrs. Hewitt with basement inventory one afternoon when you notice something in her ledger. Names that appear multiple times across different years, with gaps between residences. Mr. J. Patterson 1881-1882, and then Mr. J. Patterson 1884-1886. The same person, departed and returned, their second residence recorded in the same ledger that documented their first. People circle back, Mrs. Hewitt says when she notices you noticing. They leave for better opportunities. The opportunities don't work out or don't last. They return to what's familiar. The house doesn't judge. A good tenant is a good tenant regardless of whether it's their first stay or their third. This recontextualizes how you understand boarding house population. It's not a one-way flow of people passing through and disappearing. It's more circular, people orbiting the house, sometimes pulled away by circumstance but sometimes returning when other options fail. The boarding house is safety net and fallback option, and familiar refuge when the world proves more hostile than expected. You start recognizing patterns in the ledger when Mrs. Hewitt lets you help with administrative tasks. Certain names appear with suspicious regularity across years. Mrs. Elizabeth Cardwell has entries dating back 15 years, but not continuously. She's left and returned multiple times, each departure noted with neutral phrases like departed for family reasons or relocated for employment, each return documented with the same efficient notation as a first-time arrival. Even Morrison, legendary senior resident, has a history in the ledger. He lived here for 6 months in 1878, left, and returned in 1882 for what's now become a 3-year continuous residence. His ledger entries are exemplary in both periods, suggesting he was already a good